The sharp, stinging crack of flesh striking flesh echoed across the sprawling ballroom. The concussive wave instantly silenced the eight-piece string quartet playing in the corner. 600 of Boston's most influential socialites, real estate tycoons, and political power brokers froze in place. The ambient hum of privileged conversation died in a fraction of a second. Crystal champagne flutes hovered inches from parted lips. The scent of roasted duck and imported orchids suddenly mixed with the acrid smell of nervous sweat. I stood perfectly still on the imported marble floor. My left cheek burned with a fierce, radiating heat, and I tasted the distinct metallic flavor of blood pooling on my tongue. I did not raise a hand to soothe the skin. I did not stagger backward or cry out. I just stared into Jonathan's widening, panicked eyes, watching the man I had married 5 years ago unravel in real time. His chest heaved beneath his bespoke tuxedo. His tailored sleeves were slightly wrinkled from the force of his swing. The sting of my husband's hand across my face was not what broke my heart. It was the sudden, chilling realization that I was going to have to bankrupt his entire bloodline by Friday. Jonathan thought he had just put an uneducated country girl back in her place. He believed that striking me in front of his elite peers would cement his dominance and prove his superiority to a room full of sharks. He assumed I would run to the restroom in tears, humiliated and broken. He had no idea he had just assaulted the senior mergers and acquisitions auditor who spent the last 3 years secretly keeping his family out of federal prison. He thought he was swatting a fly. He did not know he had just provoked the apex predator holding the deed to his entire life. My name is Emma Baker, and I am 33 years old. If you have ever had to outsmart toxic people who viewed your kindness as weakness, let me know your age in the comments below. Hit the like button and subscribe to Samantha Told Stories. You will want a front row seat to this execution. To understand how I ended up bleeding in a tailored midnight blue evening gown, you have to rewind the clock exactly 20 minutes. Before the dead silence, there was polite applause. The air inside the historic downtown hotel was thick with the suffocating pressure of high society expectations. The warm glow of cascading crystal chandeliers painted the grand ballroom in a soft golden hue. Tonight was a highly publicized dual celebration. It marked the 30th anniversary of my in-laws' commercial real estate firm, alongside my 5th wedding anniversary to Jonathan. From the outside, we presented the quintessential modern success story. Jonathan sat beside me, projecting the image of a fearless, rising executive ready to inherit a vast empire. I sat quietly, playing the role I had carefully curated for half a decade. I was the unassuming wife who smiled at the right times, wore understated jewelry, and faded into the velvet wallpaper when the cameras flashed. They thought my quiet demeanor was born of intimidation. My in-laws, born into generational wealth and obsessed with country club pedigree, viewed my New Hampshire roots as a permanent stain on their polished Boston facade. I grew up in the shadow of the rugged White Mountains, surrounded by dense pine forests and freezing pristine lakes. It is an environment that breeds a very specific kind of resilience. The kind forged in long, isolated winters and silent, unyielding granite. Theodore and Constance viewed my home state as backwoods and cheap. They assumed I was a rural charity case who hit the matrimonial lottery, desperate to cling to their coattails. What they did not know, what I meticulously kept hidden behind generic department store dresses and polite nods, was my actual profession. I dismantle failing corporate empires, hunt down hidden liabilities, and restructure 9-figure toxic debts for a living. I was the anonymous ghost consultant, quietly fixing their firm's catastrophic accounting errors late into the night. I protected them from federal audits and financial ruin while they mocked my sensible shoes across the breakfast table. The ambient chatter of the ballroom died down as Theodore approached the mahogany podium. His face, perpetually flushed from decades of expensive scotch, beamed under the bright spotlight. He adjusted his silk tie and tapped the microphone. The sharp thump echoed through the sound system, commanding the room. "Distinguished guests, friends, partners!" Theodore boomed, his voice dripping with unearned authority. 30 years of shaping the skyline of this magnificent city. We built this firm on a foundation of elite excellence, a pedigree of success that separates the visionaries from the ordinary workers of the world. Polite applause rippled through the room. I kept my eyes focused on my water glass, anticipating a standard corporate victory speech filled with hollow buzzwords. But Theodore shifted his gaze from his prepared notes, settling directly on our table at the front of the room. A slick, predatory smile crept across his features. "But tonight is also about family," Theodore continued, leaning closer to the microphone. 5 years ago, my son Jonathan performed a rather remarkable act of philanthropy. The audience let out a hesitant, confused murmur. Beside me, Jonathan sat up straighter, puffing his chest out. He did not look confused. He looked proud. He adjusted his cufflinks, ready to receive praise. "Jonathan could have chosen a partner from any of the legacy families in this room," Theodore said, gesturing expansively toward the wealthy crowd. Instead, he looked north. He ventured into the rugged, unsophisticated wilderness of New Hampshire and found Emma, a girl from the backwoods, a true charity case. My breath caught in my throat. I glanced at Jonathan, waiting for him to stand up to interrupt, to defend his wife from public humiliation. Instead, Jonathan offered a modest, self-deprecating smile to the crowd, basking in the twisted praise. "We took her in," Theodore proclaimed, his tone thick with theatrical condescension. "We showed her what civilization looks like. We polished the rough edges. It takes a very generous man to overlook a distinct lack of breeding. After all, Emma's father, Victor, well, Victor is a man who chops his own firewood just to keep the lights on, a lowly lumberjack trying to survive the winter." A few rows back, a sharp, piercing giggle sliced through the tension. I turned my head a fraction of an inch. My mother-in-law, Constance, sat, adorned in a diamond necklace that cost more than a standard mortgage, hiding a smirk behind her crystal goblet. Next to her, my sister-in-law, Olivia, openly laughed, leaning over to whisper a cruel joke to the local politicians seated beside her. They were enjoying the spectacle. They were celebrating my humiliation as if it were the main course of the evening. Theodore raised his glass high into the air. "So let us toast to Jonathan, a man who builds skyscrapers and rescues strays, to charity and to the firm." The room erupted into laughter and applause. 600 people raised their glasses, drinking to the hilarious punchline of my existence. The sound washed over me, a suffocating wave of elitist mockery. I sat frozen in my gilded chair. The cold condensation from my water glass numbed my fingertips. For 5 years, I had maintained this delicate ecosystem. I swallowed their snide remarks about my upbringing. I tolerated Olivia's blatant disrespect and Constance's endless critiques of my wardrobe. I hid my true identity, my career, and the staggering reality of my own lineage because I wanted to prove to myself that I could have a normal, quiet marriage. I wanted Jonathan to love me for my character, not for the balance sheet attached to my last name. I looked at my husband. He was clinking glasses with a hedge fund manager, his perfectly capped teeth flashing in a broad, arrogant smile. He was entirely complicit. He loved the narrative that he was my savior. He needed me to be small so he could feel tall. The internal battle I fought for half a decade ceased in an instant. The illusion of my marriage evaporated, leaving behind a cold, clinical clarity. The submissive, peacekeeping wife from the mountains died right there in the ballroom. The auditor woke up. I did not just see a family of arrogant socialites anymore. I saw a hollow, failing corporate entity. I saw a group of fragile narcissists standing on a floor composed entirely of rotten wood. And I realized, with a thrilling, icy calm, that I was the only person in the room holding a match. The polite applause began to fade into a low hum of dinner conversation. Theodore stepped down from the podium, accepting handshakes and pats on the back from his peers. Jonathan turned to me, his smile slipping into a patronizing smirk. "Do not look so sensitive, Emma," Jonathan whispered, leaning in close so only I could hear the derision in his voice. "It was just a joke. Play along. You know how my dad is." I placed my linen napkin carefully on the table, lining it up perfectly with the edge of the silk table runner. The granite foundation of my heritage solidified in my spine. My 5-year experiment in living a quiet life was officially over. I pushed my chair back, the wooden legs scraping sharply against the polished floor, and stood up. The scrape of my wooden chair against the polished floor felt like a gunshot cutting through the fading polite applause. I did not sit back down. I began walking. The distance from our front row table to the mahogany podium was exactly 32 steps. I counted each one, letting the rhythm ground me. I kept my posture straight, my chin parallel to the floor. The heavy silk of my midnight blue evening gown brushed against the imported rugs. Theodore still lingered near the base of the small stage, accepting congratulations from a passing senator. His flushed face twisted into a confused scowl as I approached. He assumed I was coming forward to offer a tearful, embarrassing apology, or perhaps to play the role of the grateful, submissive charity case he had just described to the city elite. He took a half step toward me, raising his hand in a patronizing gesture to guide me away from the center of attention. I ignored his outstretched hand. I stepped right past him and gripped the cool metal of the microphone stand. The lingering chatter in the vast room sputtered out. 600 faces turned toward the stage. I did not look at Jonathan. I did not look at the politicians or the hedge fund managers. I locked my eyes directly onto Constance. My mother-in-law sat at the head table, still clutching her crystal goblet, a condescending smirk resting on her painted lips. For half a decade, this woman had critiqued my vocabulary, evaluated my posture, and treated my very existence as a tragic burden her son had to carry. Her immense generational wealth built the foundation of Theodore and his towering arrogance. "Theodore is right about one crucial detail tonight," I spoke into the microphone. My voice carried a calm, crystalline clarity that reached the furthest corners of the cavernous ballroom. This firm was built on a very specific type of foundation. I let the words hang in the stifling air. The silence was thick, heavy with sudden confusion of silent desperation. I continued, keeping my gaze locked on Constance. The smirk on her face began to waver. "You see, Constance, your husband loves to talk about his visionary developments. He loves to boast about the skyline he claims to have built. What he forgot to mention during his touching toast is how he actually funds those empty skyscrapers." Theodore lunged toward the stage, his face draining of its drunken color. His polished veneer cracked, revealing sheer panic. "Turn her microphone off!" he hissed at the sound technician hovering near the curtain. The technician, frozen by the sheer tension, did not move a single muscle. "For the past 18 months," I announced, projecting my voice over Theodore and his sudden frantic commands, "Theodore has been secretly liquidating your grandfather's irrevocable family trust. He has drained over $15 million from your personal inheritance to cover margin calls on 3 catastrophic commercial defaults." The ballroom inhaled sharply as one singular entity. As a senior mergers and acquisitions auditor, I track paper trails that desperate men think they have successfully burned. I find the buried ledgers hidden behind obscure shell corporations. Theodore had siphoned his wife's generational wealth just to keep the lights on in this hotel tonight. I had spent countless nights burying his incompetence, fixing his catastrophic zoning violations, and restructuring his toxic loans so he could continue parading around Boston high society. I was the ghost keeping his sinking ship afloat. The impact of my words hit the room with devastating force. Constance dropped her crystal goblet. The glass hit the table and shattered, sending expensive champagne spilling across the pristine white linen. Her face turned a sickly, ghostly pale. Olivia sat beside her, mouth hanging open, her diamond necklace suddenly looking like a very heavy chain. The hedge fund managers and investors seated at the front tables immediately pulled out their phones. Thumbs flew across screens, typing frantic messages to their financial advisors to pull their capital. The pristine, invincible image of the real estate empire shattered into jagged, worthless pieces right before their eyes. Jonathan realized his inheritance, his entire curated identity, was evaporating into the chandelier-lit air. He lost his mind. Driven by pure narcissistic terror, Jonathan charged the stage. His footsteps were frantic and heavy, abandoning all cultivated Boston manners. He reached the podium in seconds, his face twisted into an ugly snarl of sheer desperation. He did not yell. He did not attempt to silence me with words. He swung his arm. The sharp, stinging crack of flesh striking flesh echoed across the sprawling ballroom. The concussive wave instantly silenced the 8-piece string quartet playing in the corner. 600 of Boston's most influential socialites, real estate tycoons, and political power brokers froze in place. I stood perfectly still on the imported marble floor. My left cheek burned with a fierce, radiating heat, and I tasted the distinct metallic flavor of blood pooling on my tongue. I did not raise a hand to soothe the skin. I did not stagger backward or cry out. I just stared into Jonathan's widening, panicked eyes, watching the man I had married unravel in real time. For a fraction of a second, I thought someone in this room full of civilized, educated people might step forward to condemn a man for striking his wife. I was wrong. The initial shock quickly dissolved into cruel, judgmental whispers. "Insane gold digger," a wealthy socialite muttered from the front row. "She is having a hysterical breakdown," an investor whispered to his wife, shaking his head in disgust. They did not defend me. They closed ranks to protect the institution. In their twisted, privileged world, a husband striking his wife was an acceptable response if she dared to challenge his authority and threaten their investments. They viewed me as an insubordinate parasite, trying to destroy a legacy I could never understand. Jonathan stood towering over me, chest heaving beneath his bespoke tuxedo. He pointed a shaking finger directly at my face. His voice dripped with venom and superiority. "You ungrateful, psychotic creature!" Jonathan hissed his words, carrying across the quiet room. "How dare you bite the hand that feeds you? Get out of my sight! Get out of this hotel before I have security drag you into the street!" I knelt down and picked up the small clutch purse I had dropped when the impact knocked me sideways. I felt the warm blood weeping from the corner of my split lip. The love was entirely gone. The obligation was erased. I looked at Jonathan not as my husband, but as a hollow liability waiting to be liquidated. I did not shed a single tear. I pulled my phone from my clutch. Jonathan let out a harsh, theatrical laugh, aiming his performance at the wealthy investors to salvage his pride. "What are you doing, Emma? Are you calling an Uber? You better hope your credit card still works, because I am cutting you off right now. You are going back to the gutter." I bypassed his frantic noise entirely. I unlocked my screen and tapped the only contact I needed. The line rang exactly once before his deep, familiar voice answered the call. "Dad," I said, keeping my tone perfectly level and empty of the tears everyone in the room expected me to shed. "Please come." I lowered the phone and slid it back into my clutch. Jonathan burst into another loud, obnoxious laugh that echoed off the high ceilings. He pointed a finger at me and looked around at the crowd, ensuring they were all paying attention to his impromptu comedy show. "Did you hear that, everyone?" Jonathan shouted, his voice thick with condescension. "She just called her daddy. What is he going to do, Emma? Is Victor going to drive his rusted-out pickup truck down from the mountains to save you? Is your broke mountain man going to chop some firewood in the valet line to teach me a lesson? He cannot even afford a suit to wear in this lobby." A few sycophantic business partners chuckled nervously, trying to align themselves with the man they still believed held the power. I did not offer a rebuttal. I did not scream or demand respect. I simply stared at Jonathan, maintaining a cold, terrifying silence. I looked at his expensive tailored jacket and his perfectly capped teeth. He was so profoundly delusional that he was actively bragging about his superiority while standing on a trapdoor I had just unlatched. He honestly believed he had outsmarted a naive girl from the woods. He had no idea that the broke mountain man he was mocking controlled a $50 billion global private equity firm. He had no idea that his entire family real estate portfolio was a rounding error on my father's balance sheet. I turned my back on my husband and walked slowly toward the grand exit doors. The rhythmic click of my heels against the marble floor was the only sound accompanying my departure. I left the suffocating ballroom behind, knowing the apocalypse was already on its way, and Jonathan had just handed me the match to burn his world to ash. The heavy brass doors of the hotel pushed open, forcing me out into the biting winter storm. Boston in late November carries a specific brand of misery. The freezing rain fell in sharp diagonal sheets, stinging my bare arms and soaking the hem of my evening gown. I stepped off the heated carpet of the valet stand and onto the hard, wet concrete of the curb. Jonathan followed me to the threshold. He remained safely underneath the glowing, heated awning, flanked by two nervous hotel security guards. He pointed a rigid finger toward the street, ordering the staff to ensure I stayed out in the elements. He wanted me to shiver. He wanted me to feel the raw physical cost of my disobedience. "Let the cold wake you up," Jonathan shouted over the howling wind. "Maybe standing in the freezing sleet will help you remember who pays for your lifestyle. Call your father. Let us see how long it takes a rusted pickup truck to crawl down the interstate." I did not wrap my arms around myself to preserve heat. I stood tall, facing the dark flooded avenue. My cheek throbbed from the impact of his hand, a dull, pulsating ache that grounded me in the present reality. The polished facade of my marriage was gone, leaving only the sharp, unyielding granite of my true nature. The distant sound of approaching engines cut through the noise of the storm. It was not the clanking rattle of a broken exhaust pipe. It was a deep, synchronized baritone vibration. The sound resonated through the flooded asphalt, traveling up through the soles of my shoes. It was the distinct mechanical purr of specialized high-performance machinery. 3 identical matte black SUVs turned the corner in perfect unison. They did not slow down to ask for directions or wait for the valet attendants to clear a path. They glided toward the hotel entrance with predatory purpose. The lead vehicle swerved sharply into the drop-off lane, forcing a line of luxury sedans to hastily reverse out of the way. The other 2 SUVs boxed in the perimeter, effectively shutting down the entire street. Traffic behind them ground to an immediate halt. The doors opened simultaneously. 6 tall men, wearing dark tactical raincoats, stepped out into the downpour. They wore transparent earpieces and moved with rigid military precision. They did not look at the angry drivers honking their horns or the stunned hotel staff. They formed an impenetrable human wall around the curb where I stood, isolating me from the chaotic street and my gaping husband. The rear door of the center vehicle swung open. My father stepped out into the freezing Boston rain. Victor Baker did not look like the rural charity case Jonathan loved to mock at dinner parties. My father was the architect of a $50 billion global private equity firm. He bought failing corporations, stripped them to the studs, and rebuilt them into towering financial monoliths. He was a kingmaker who preferred the quiet solitude of the New Hampshire wilderness over the suffocating pretense of high society charity galas. Tonight he wore a thick, rugged flannel jacket layered effortlessly over a bespoke charcoal suit. The aesthetic was a flawless fusion of self-reliant mountain resilience and undeniable Wall Street supremacy. He walked toward me with slow, deliberate steps, his expensive leather shoes stepping directly into the freezing puddles without hesitation. Jonathan stared at the incoming fleet, his arrogant sneer faltering. The cognitive dissonance paralyzed him. He tried to reconcile the image of the broke lumberjack he had just insulted with the terrifying reality of the tactical convoy parked on his curb. His fragile ego demanded that he reassert his dominance in front of the watching hotel guests. "What is this theatrical nonsense?" Jonathan yelled, stepping out from beneath the heated awning. He puffed out his chest, trying to project authority over the roaring storm. "Did you rent a fleet of cars on my credit card to put on a show for your daddy? You think hiring a few bouncers makes you look powerful?" Victor did not even look at my husband. He treated Jonathan like a mild, irrelevant breeze. My father calmly raised his left wrist, pushing back the cuff of his flannel jacket to check the time. The harsh streetlights caught the subtle, flawless gleam of a platinum Patek Philippe watch. It was an understated timepiece that cost more than Jonathan earned in 2 years. Jonathan saw the watch. His eyes darted from the platinum dial to the tactical guards securing the perimeter. A sickening realization began to crawl up his throat, but his narcissism refused to let him surrender the stage. He took another step forward, raising his voice to demand attention. "I am speaking to you," Jonathan demanded, his voice cracking slightly under the immense tension of the standoff. "Get these vehicles off the valet ramp right now, or I am calling the police. You have no right to disrupt my event." Victor finally stopped walking. He turned his head slowly and locked eyes with the man who had just struck his daughter. My father did not raise his voice over the rain. He did not issue a single verbal threat or throw a punch. He simply delivered a look of pure, unfiltered ice. It was the gaze of an apex predator assessing a remarkably weak prey. The sheer, crushing weight of that stare hit Jonathan like a physical blow to the chest. The arrogant executive, who had just paraded around a ballroom of 600 people, instantly shrank. Jonathan stumbled backward, his leather shoes slipping on the wet concrete. Primal fear hijacked his nervous system, forcing him to retreat back underneath the awning, hiding behind the bewildered hotel security guards. Victor turned his attention back to me. He unbuttoned his heavy flannel jacket and slipped it off his broad shoulders. He draped the thick, warm fabric around my shivering frame, pulling the lapels tight across my chest. The scent of wood smoke and crisp cedar enveloped me, providing an instant shield against the biting cold. "Let us go home," Victor said quietly. He placed a steady hand on my back and guided me toward the open door of the armored SUV. I climbed into the spacious leather interior, leaving the freezing storm behind. Victor slid in right beside me. The heavy soundproof door pulled shut with a solid, definitive click, instantly muting the chaotic noise of the street and the pathetic, fading shouts of my husband. The cabin of the vehicle was remarkably warm and illuminated by soft amber lighting. The convoy began to move smoothly, pulling away from the curb and leaving the glittering hotel shrinking in the rearview mirror. I leaned my head back against the plush headrest, letting the tension drain from my spine. The adrenaline that had fueled my confrontation in the ballroom began to recede, leaving me with a stark, crystalline focus. I turned to look at my father. Victor was studying my face. The ambient light illuminated the dark, swelling bruise forming along my left cheekbone. The skin was tender, marked by the distinct shape of Jonathan's furious hand. I saw the muscles in my father's jaw clenched tight. The calm, composed exterior he had maintained on the street hardened into something lethal. He did not offer empty words of comfort or ask me how I felt. Men who control global empires do not deal in sentimentality when their bloodline is attacked. They deal in total strategic destruction. Victor reached over and tapped a secure communications button on the leather armrest, opening a direct line to his executive corporate team. "Initiate Project Demolition," Victor commanded, his tone devoid of any mercy. "Target every asset tied to the Boston real estate portfolio. I want them bleeding by morning." The emotional ties to my marriage were severed permanently with that single sentence. The facade of the quiet, submissive wife was dead. The real game was just beginning, and Jonathan was entirely unaware that he had just forced his own head into the guillotine. He believed he had won a domestic dispute by throwing me out into the rain. He was currently walking back into that hotel, smoothing his tie and preparing to spin a tale about his crazy ex-wife to his elite friends. He felt powerful. He felt untouchable. He had no idea that tomorrow morning his desperate need to project infinite wealth would lead him directly into the darkest, most unforgiving trap of his entire fraudulent career. By morning, Jonathan would rush to cement his authority, setting the stage for a financial ambush that would strip him of everything he claimed to own. The morning sun rose over the Boston harbor, casting long, sharp shadows across the floor-to-ceiling windows of my private penthouse. This secure residence was held under a blind trust operated by my father. Jonathan did not know this sanctuary existed. He believed I spent the night wandering the freezing streets or curled up on a plastic chair in a crowded bus terminal. I stood in the center of the serene, quiet living room, holding a warm cup of black coffee. The chaotic noise of the anniversary gala felt like a distant, fading memory, replaced by a profound, crystalline focus. My cell phone vibrated against the marble kitchen island. It was not a single notification. It was a rapid, relentless barrage of digital alerts. I walked over and picked up the device. The screen was flooded with glaring red warning banners from my primary banking application. Access denied. Joint account suspended by court order. I unlocked the phone and opened my secure legal portal. Jonathan had spent his early morning orchestrating a hostile domestic takeover. Driven by bruised pride and a desperate need to reassert his dominance, he marched into a local county courthouse the moment the doors opened. He utilized a friendly judge who frequented his father's country club to file an ex parte emergency injunction. This specific legal maneuver allowed him to secure a temporary freeze on all shared marital assets without giving me a single opportunity to defend myself in front of a magistrate. He locked the checking accounts. He suspended the joint credit cards. He even managed to freeze the digital payment applications linked to his primary email address. He wanted to ensure I could not purchase a cup of coffee, let alone retain high-powered legal counsel. A new text message chimed, cutting through the banking alerts. It was from Jonathan. "I hope you brought a heavy winter coat," the message read. "The homeless shelters downtown fill up very fast this time of year. I formally served your eviction notice to the empty air in our hallway. Do not bother coming back to the estate for your cheap, sensible shoes. My staff is tossing your garbage into the alley where it belongs. You chose to bite the hand that fed you. Enjoy starving." I read the cruel, gloating words twice. He truly believed he had executed a flawless financial starvation tactic. He assumed my entire existence depended on his arbitrary generosity. He did not realize my personal wealth was insulated within a $3 billion trust fund in New Hampshire. He was trying to drain the ocean with a slotted spoon. Before I could set the phone down, a different application sent a silent push notification to my screen. It was the integrated smart home security system tied to the marital estate. Jonathan was so frantic to cut off my financial access that he forgot to revoke my digital administrative privileges to the property cameras. I opened the live video feed. The high-definition camera, mounted above the grand front doors, displayed the pristine, manicured driveway. A sleek silver sports car pulled up to the curb. Jonathan stepped out of the driver's seat, wearing a fresh, tailored suit. He walked around to the passenger side and opened the door. A young woman stepped onto the pavement. Her name was Alyssa. I recognized her instantly from the brief, hushed whispers shared among the junior executives at the real estate firm. Alyssa was not a brilliant professional or a supportive partner. She was a symptom of Jonathan's endless craving for superficial validation. She wore an expensive designer trench coat and carried 2 oversized leather overnight bags. Jonathan was not just evicting me. He was immediately installing his mistress into our marital home less than 12 hours after I departed. He wanted to project an image of untouchable perfection. By parading a new shiny accessory onto his front porch, he was desperately trying to convince himself that he held all the power. I watched the silent video feed as Jonathan wrapped his arm around Alyssa's waist. They stood on the front steps, sharing a prolonged, victorious kiss right in front of the security lens. He was flaunting his infidelity, assuming I was watching from a gutter, weeping over my shattered life. I did not feel a single pang of sorrow. Watching another woman walk into that toxic house felt like watching a stranger willingly step into a steel bear trap. I took a slow sip of my coffee, letting the rich, dark roast settle my nerves. If I wanted to win this war, I needed Jonathan to remain blind to my actual resources. I needed his ego to swell to a dangerous, unsustainable size. A predator is most vulnerable when they believe their prey is already dead. I decided to give my husband exactly what he craved. I set my coffee mug on the counter and cleared my throat. I practiced my breathing, forcing my chest to heave in short, erratic bursts. I squeezed my eyes shut until tears began to prick the corners of my lashes. I needed to sound utterly broken, defeated, and desperate. I pressed the call button on Jonathan's contact profile. The line rang 4 times. He sent it straight to voicemail, proving he wanted to prolong my suffering. The recorded greeting finished, and the beep signaled my cue. "Jonathan, please," I whispered, letting my voice crack into a pathetic, ragged sob. "I am standing outside a grocery store right now. My card declined. The cashier humiliated me. I have nowhere to go, and the wind is freezing. You cannot do this to me. You took the house, and now you took my money. Please, just unlock the checking account so I can buy some food. I am so sorry for what happened at the gala. Just please, show some mercy." I let out one final stifled weep and ended the call. I lowered the phone and wiped the fake tear from my cheek. My posture straightened instantly. The trembling in my shoulders vanished, replaced by a calm, calculating stillness. Less than 2 minutes later, my screen lit up with his response. "Actions have consequences, Emma. You embarrassed my family in front of the entire city. Alyssa is moving in today. She actually knows how to treat a successful executive with respect. Stop calling my phone. You are getting nothing." I smiled. He swallowed the bait whole. Feeding his towering narcissism yielded the exact result I anticipated. Because Jonathan believed he had effortlessly crushed my spirit, he felt invincible. He felt like an untouchable corporate giant who could eliminate any obstacle with a single phone call. That specific brand of unearned confidence makes a man incredibly sloppy. My secure corporate channels began lighting up with industry alerts regarding his real estate firm. Emboldened by his perceived domestic victory, Jonathan was rushing his next move. He was not satisfied with merely evicting his wife. He wanted the throne. He scheduled an emergency executive board meeting for that very afternoon to officially force his disgraced father to step down and formally claim the title of Chief Executive Officer. He was sprinting toward the executive chair without conducting a single independent audit of the corporate ledgers. He was too busy celebrating with his mistress to look under the floorboards of his own company. He did not know about the missing federal funds. He did not know about the toxic shadow loans. He just wanted the shiny title and the corner office. I walked into the master bedroom of my penthouse and opened the cedar closet. I bypassed the casual clothing and reached for a sharp, tailored charcoal blazer. I paired it with a crisp white silk blouse and dark trousers. I needed to look like the apex predator I truly was. Jonathan thought the legal system was his personal weapon. He thought freezing a joint checking account was a masterstroke of financial warfare. He had entirely forgotten about the draconian legal contract his own father forced me to sign 5 years ago. He thought he was shielding his empire from a poor girl. He had no idea he built an ironclad shield around a billionaire. I grabbed my leather briefcase and headed for the door. It was time to meet my corporate litigator. We had a specific prenuptial agreement to execute, and I was ready to use their own predatory trap to sever the final marital chains. The private elevator ascended silently toward the top floor of a sleek glass tower overlooking the Boston Harbor. My reflection in the polished steel doors revealed a woman dressed in a sharp charcoal blazer and dark trousers. The helpless, weeping victim, who had left a desperate voicemail just an hour ago, was nowhere to be found. The doors parted smoothly, revealing a sprawling lobby defined by imported dark wood and hushed professionalism. This was the domain of Lawrence Mitchell. Lawrence was a senior corporate litigator who managed the private affairs of true Wall Street heavyweights. He did not advertise his services on highway billboards or television commercials. He operated in the discreet shadows of extreme wealth, ensuring that fortunes remained intact during hostile separations. I walked past the silent reception desk and entered his corner office. The room smelled of rich leather and fresh espresso. Lawrence sat behind a broad mahogany desk holding a thin stack of cheap printer paper. His tailored suit jacket was unbuttoned, revealing a subtle pinstripe pattern. He looked up as I took a seat in the plush armchair opposite him. A wry, amused smile played at the corners of his mouth. He tossed the thin stack of paper across the smooth wooden surface. "Your husband hired a discount attorney from a strip mall," Lawrence stated, his tone laced with clinical detachment. "These just arrived via a standard courier service. The legal formatting is sloppy, and the demands read like a petty ransom note written by a petulant child." I picked up the demand letters. The paper felt thin and cheap beneath my fingertips. Jonathan was attempting to leverage his newly perceived dominance to extract every last drop of my dignity. The text dictated that I must surrender the remaining balance of my personal checking account to cover his legal fees. He demanded I sign over the title to my modest 5-year-old sedan, claiming it was a marital asset purchased with his hard-earned income. He even included a punitive clause, threatening to sue me for public defamation regarding my comments at the anniversary gala unless I agreed to a swift, uncontested divorce. "He is offering you a highly generous settlement," Lawrence noted, tapping a silver pen against his desk. "He is willing to let you keep your personal clothing and your laptop, provided you sign a non-disclosure agreement forbidding you from ever speaking about his family again." He genuinely believes he holds all the leverage in this negotiation. I scanned the threatening paragraphs, feeling a profound sense of tranquility. Jonathan was trying to squeeze water from a stone, operating under the delusion that I was terrified of poverty. He was so blinded by his soaring ego and his shiny new mistress that he forgot the fundamental rules his own father had established. I reached into my leather briefcase and pulled out a heavy document bound in a thick navy blue cover. I placed it gently on top of Jonathan's pathetic demand letters. The unmistakable seal of a premier Boston law firm was embossed on the front. Jonathan's lawyer failed to review the existing marital documentation, I said, leaning back into the leather chair. 5 years ago, Theodore summoned me to his home office 2 weeks before the wedding. He locked the doors and slid this exact document across his desk. He looked at me with an expression of pure, unadulterated disgust. I let the memory wash over the room, painting the picture for Lawrence. Theodore had smoked a thick cigar, blowing the pungent gray smoke directly into my face. He told me that girls from the rugged mountains of New Hampshire were notorious for seeking easy payouts. He declared that his precious commercial real estate empire would never fall into the hands of a rural charity case. He demanded a draconian prenuptial agreement designed to strip me of any future rights. Lawrence opened the blue cover and skimmed the highly restrictive clauses. His sharp eyes tracked the dense legal jargon. The terms were brutal and unforgiving. The contract explicitly mandated a strict separation of all premarital assets and any future inherited wealth. It featured a ruthless waiver of spousal support under any circumstances. The defining principle of the entire document was a simple, devastating rule. What is yours, and what is mine is mine. Theodore thought he was building an impenetrable wall to keep a peasant out of his castle, I explained, watching Lawrence read the final signatures. He viewed my father as a lowly lumberjack who chopped firewood to pay the heating bill. He assumed my family possessed nothing of value. His staggering classism prevented him from running a basic background check. If Theodore had bothered to look past his own prejudices, he would have discovered the staggering truth about Victor Baker. My grandfather started a small timber business that my father scaled into a global private equity titan. The rugged flannel and the mountain cabin were just aesthetic choices for a man who preferred the quiet strength of the wilderness over the fragile pretense of high society. The trust fund tied to my name sits in a heavily encrypted account, shielded by layers of corporate entities. The current valuation exceeds $3 billion. By forcing me to sign that predatory prenuptial agreement, Theodore unknowingly drafted a flawless legal shield for my inheritance. Had we married without a contract, Jonathan might have found a sympathetic judge willing to award him a percentage of the marital appreciation on my hidden assets. He could have dragged me through years of agonizing discovery, tying up my resources in endless court battles. Instead, Theodore handed me an ironclad guarantee that Jonathan could never touch a single cent of my family legacy. Lawrence let out a rich, booming laugh that echoed off the glass windows. He shook his head, setting the prenuptial agreement back on the desk. The irony is magnificent, Emma. Jonathan is sending threatening letters demanding your used sedan, while waiving a contract that legally bars him from accessing billions. They built their own cage and locked it from the inside. I reached for the silver pen resting near Lawrence's hand. I did not want a protracted domestic skirmish. I did not want to barter over a house tainted by Alyssa's presence or bank accounts that held trivial sums. I wanted a clean, surgical separation. Draft the response, I instructed, my voice dropping into a cool, commanding register. Accept every single one of Jonathan's demands exactly as they are written. Give him the frozen checking accounts. Give him the keys to the sedan. Agree to the non-disclosure clause regarding the gala. Sign the divorce papers in strict adherence to Theodore's prenuptial agreement. Lawrence raised an eyebrow, clearly intrigued by my willingness to surrender the minor assets so quickly. You are handing him a flawless, undisputed victory on paper. His ego will swell to a dangerous proportion. That is the precise goal, I replied, tapping the desk. A predator is most vulnerable when he thinks his prey is dead. Jonathan needs to feel invincible today. He needs to believe he successfully starved me out and secured his throne. If we fight him over a used car, he will stay on high alert. If we surrender, he will drop his guard. I signed my name with a fluid, sweeping motion on the preliminary consent forms. With each stroke of the pen, the heavy, toxic chains of my marriage dissolved into thin air. I was walking away from the marital estate cleanly, leaving Jonathan holding a worthless, empty bag. The personal battlefield was now entirely cleared. I stood up and retrieved my briefcase. The domestic drama was merely a distraction. The real war required a much darker arena. Jonathan was currently parading around his corporate headquarters, boasting about his new mistress and his sudden rise to executive power. He thought the game was over. He had no idea I was heading straight to my multi-monitor command center to dissect the digital bones of his company. The public ledgers of his real estate empire projected a pristine image of success. But I knew how arrogant men hid their dirty secrets. It was time to breach the shadow servers and uncover the lethal rot decaying beneath his polished floors. I left the quiet professionalism of Lawrence Mitchell and navigated the bustling Boston streets toward my true domain. My secure penthouse overlooked the harbor, offering a breathtaking view of the Atlantic coastline, but the interior held no decorative frills. The main room functioned as a sterile, high-functioning command center. 4 curved monitors hummed quietly on a heavy steel desk. The ambient blue light cast long, sharp shadows across the hardwood floor. This was where I hunted. The soft glow of the screens transported me back to the harsh winter mornings in the White Mountains. When I was 12 years old, my father dragged me out into the biting December cold. Victor handed me a heavy iron splitting maul. He did not teach me to swing the tool with blind fury or reckless force. He taught me to read the wood. Look for the hairline fractures, he instructed, while his breath plumed in the freezing air. Find the existing fault lines and let the weight of the steel do the work. You never force the break. You expose the weakness. Later that same evening, sitting by the stone hearth, he placed a dense corporate balance sheet in front of me. He pointed a calloused finger at a column of inflated assets. He told me that financial statements behave exactly like timber. Every corrupt company possesses a hidden fracture. You just have to locate the rot and strike with surgical precision. Jonathan and Theodore projected a flawless public image. Their quarterly real estate reports gleamed with engineered perfection, designed to dazzle investors and maintain their country club status. Arrogance, however, breeds profound digital laziness. Men who cheat on their wives and mock their peers invariably reuse simple passwords and leave digital backdoors wide open. I booted up my custom decryption software, sitting back in my ergonomic leather chair. As a senior auditor, breaking into poorly constructed shadow servers was a routine exercise. I bypassed his primary firewalls in less than 20 minutes. The screen shifted from a security lock prompt to a cascading stream of raw, unredacted banking data. I ignored the public accounts and dove straight into the payroll ledgers. The numbers flashed rapidly across my monitors. I searched for the hidden fault lines my father taught me to recognize. The discrepancy appeared buried deep within a nested folder labeled Operational Logistics. My eyes scanned the columns, tracing a relentless hemorrhagic cash flow. Jonathan was bleeding his own firm dry. He was not just skimming marginal profits to cover expensive dinners. He had crossed a fatal, unforgiving boundary. For the past 3 years, he systematically diverted the federal tax withholdings of his entire workforce. Every paycheck issued to a secretary, an administrative assistant, or a junior broker showed a standard deduction for the Internal Revenue Service. That money never reached the government. Jonathan routed millions of dollars into dummy shell accounts registered to fictitious consulting groups. He utilized those stolen federal funds to purchase imported sports cars and finance Alyssa. He bought his mistress designer wardrobes and leased luxury downtown condominiums using money embezzled directly from the federal government. He funded his entire illusion of superiority by stealing from the very people who scrubbed his floors and answered his phones. This was not a minor accounting error to be swept under the rug with a clever public relations spin. It was a severe felony, carrying mandatory federal prison sentences. The authorities do not negotiate stolen payroll taxes. They investigate, and they prosecute with extreme prejudice. The stolen taxes alone would trigger a devastating federal raid. A man bleeding that much capital always tries to plug the holes with toxic bandages. I opened the encrypted liabilities index to measure the full scope of the infection. The screen displayed a recent transaction that made my pulse steady into a cold, rhythmic beat. 8 months ago, Jonathan secured a $10 million emergency cash injection. The lender was not a traditional bank or a reputable financial institution. The digital letterhead belonged to a predatory shadow syndicate operating in the unregulated corners of corporate finance. They dealt exclusively in mezzanine debt, charging exorbitant interest rates and enforcing ruthless collection policies. They preyed on desperate executives providing fast capital in exchange for soul-crushing terms. Predatory lenders do not hand over $10 million on a polite handshake. They demand tangible blood. I accessed the loan collateral annex to see exactly what Jonathan had surrendered to secure the cash. He pledged the commercial headquarters of the real estate firm. That asset alone was insufficient for the shadow brokers to justify the risk. They demanded prime, unencumbered residential real estate to lock down the deal. I scrolled down the digital contract and stopped my breath catching in my throat. Jonathan had secretly attached the property deeds to Theodore's sprawling estate and Olivia's gated mansion. The guarantor's signatures at the bottom of the pages were flawless forgeries. Jonathan copied his father's heavy scrawl and his sister's looping cursive perfectly. He secretly mortgaged his entire family's future to maintain his charade of wealth and fund his illicit affairs. He stole the roofs right over their heads while smiling at them across the dinner table. The terms of the mezzanine loan contained a deadly acceleration clause. The legal jargon was dense, but the translation was brutally simple. If the borrower missed a single scheduled payment, the lender retained the legal right to demand the entire $10 million principal immediately. If the funds were not produced within 48 hours, the lender could bypass standard court proceedings and instantly foreclose on all listed collateral. The next staggering balloon payment was scheduled for this upcoming Friday. Jonathan possessed zero liquid capital to meet that obligation. He drained the accounts to impress Alyssa and project fake dominance over me. He built his own guillotine and placed his family's necks squarely on the chopping block. The trap was perfectly constructed, but it required a specific target sitting in the executive chair when the blade finally dropped. Jonathan was currently parading around Boston, desperate to steal his father's crown. His ego demanded the title of Chief Executive Officer to prove to his mistress and his peers that he was the ultimate authority. By tomorrow morning, he would make a fatal legal move to secure that throne, unknowingly chaining himself to a sinking ship. He was preparing to file the paperwork that would make him the sole target of the incoming federal storm. The morning after the gala disaster, Jonathan did not wake up with a sense of caution or a desire for self-reflection. He woke up with a ravenous hunger for absolute control. The public execution of his father's reputation at the anniversary event provided the exact opening he had been waiting for his entire adult life. He left his mistress lounging in the master bedroom of my former home and drove his imported sports car directly to the commercial headquarters of the real estate firm. He was a man possessed by the intoxicating illusion of his own brilliance. He strode through the double-glass doors of the executive suite, ignoring the panicked whispers of the administrative staff. The firm was in a state of sheer chaos. Investors were calling relentlessly, demanding explanations for the missing trust funds I had exposed. Jonathan marched straight into the corner office. Theodore sat behind his massive desk, looking like a deflated balloon. The arrogant patriarch who had ruthlessly mocked my New Hampshire roots just 2 days ago was nursing a severe hangover and a permanently shattered social image. Jonathan did not offer his father sympathy or a strategic defense plan. He offered an ultimatum. He slammed his palms onto the polished wood and demanded Theodore step down immediately. Jonathan argued that the only way to salvage the firm and appease the terrified board of directors was a swift, decisive change in leadership. He blamed his father for the public relations nightmare, conveniently ignoring his own violent outburst on the stage. Theodore, exhausted, humiliated, and completely drained of his usual venom, lacked the strength to fight back. With a trembling hand, the disgraced patriarch signed the succession documents, officially surrendering the title of Chief Executive Officer to his son. Jonathan grabbed the signed paper and walked out of the office, feeling like a conquering emperor. He had finally snatched the crown he believed he fundamentally deserved. But a crown made of paper offers zero protection against a coming storm. His immediate problem was liquidity. Jonathan knew the firm was experiencing a severe cash crunch, though he was entirely oblivious to the true, devastating depths of the shadow ledgers. He believed the financial strain was merely a temporary hurdle caused by his father's sloppy management. He needed a rapid injection of capital to keep the lights on, and more importantly, to maintain the lavish lifestyle he was currently promising Alyssa. He contacted a premier commercial underwriter to secure a massive new line of credit. The banking executives, however, were not fools. They had seen the news regarding Theodore. They refused to authorize a single cent until Jonathan could legally prove that his father was completely removed from the operational structure. The underwriters demanded a formal court-filed declaration establishing Jonathan as the sole, undisputed fiduciary of the company. They required a legally binding assumption of liabilities, explicitly stating that Jonathan, personally and professionally, guaranteed all corporate debts, encumbrances, and obligations past and present. A rational executive would have immediately paused. A competent leader would have hired an independent forensic accounting firm to audit every single ledger before signing a blanket assumption of unseen liabilities. But Jonathan was neither rational nor competent. He was a narcissist, running on pure adrenaline and bottomless greed. He viewed the legal requirement not as a massive red flag, but as a glorious opportunity to cement his absolute dominion. He ordered his corporate counsel to draft the emergency injunction right then and there. He wanted to file it with the local magistrate before the afternoon session ended, ensuring his absolute control was a matter of public record. With a swift, arrogant stroke of his expensive fountain pen, Jonathan signed his name on the dotted line. He formally and legally claimed total responsibility for the entire real estate empire. He did not know he had just volunteered to take the fall for a massive federal crime. Miles away in my secure command center, my digital portal chimed with a high-priority notification. The automated legal tracking software I had installed to monitor the firm's public filings flashed green. I opened the encrypted document on my center monitor. It was a digital copy of the emergency assumption of liabilities Jonathan had just submitted to the court. My secure phone buzzed a moment later. Lawrence was on the line. Even through the digital connection, I could hear the sheer disbelief in my litigator's voice. "He actually filed it," Emma Lawrence stated, his tone laced with professional awe. "I am looking at the county clerk stamp right now. Jonathan just submitted an unconditional guarantee of all corporate obligations. He waived his right to an independent audit, and he explicitly shielded his father from retroactive operational debt. He is begging the court to recognize him as the sole responsible party." I leaned forward, resting my elbows on the steel desk. A slow, terrifying smile spread across my face. "He wants the glory, Lawrence," I replied, keeping my voice smooth and perfectly controlled. "He is so desperate to prove he is the ultimate corporate titan that he completely bypassed basic due diligence. He just wants to sit in the big chair and tell his mistress that he owns the city." Lawrence chuckled a low, dark sound. "He just strapped himself to a sinking ship and threw the only life vest into the ocean. If we object to this filing, we might accidentally trigger a review period that gives him time to actually look at the books. What are your instructions?" Do absolutely nothing I commanded. Do not file a single objection. Do not submit a countermotion. Let the judge stamp that document and enter it into the permanent public record. We are going to let him lock the doors from the inside. I ended the call and stared at the glowing monitor. The beauty of federal corporate law is its absolute unforgiving nature. The Internal Revenue Service does not care about family drama. They do not care about who originally drafted a fraudulent scheme. When the automated auditing systems finally flag the millions of dollars in stolen employee tax withholdings, the federal agents are going to look for one specific signature. They target the person sitting in the executive chair. They prosecute the individual who legally assumed the fiduciary duty of the company. By rushing to the courthouse to prove his dominance, Jonathan had just provided the federal government with a perfectly wrapped, legally binding confession. He was now personally liable for the massive tax fraud, and he was personally chained to the $10 million toxic loan he himself had cross-collateralized against his family's homes. Jonathan thought he was building an empire, but he had simply signed his own death warrant. He believed he had successfully pushed me out of his life, securing a future of unlimited wealth and prestige. He was currently sitting behind a massive mahogany desk, basking in the illusion of his absolute supremacy. He had no idea that while he was busy trying to secure a standard line of credit, I was preparing to execute a financial maneuver that would wipe his entire bloodline off the map. He needed that new bank loan to make his Friday balloon payment to the shadow lenders. But traditional banks move slowly, and Friday was approaching with terrifying speed. The trap was perfectly baited, and Jonathan had willingly swallowed the hook. The legal shield he thought he had forged was actually a lightning rod, and the storm was already gathering right above his head. I did not need to wait for the federal government to discover the tax fraud to begin my assault. I had a much faster, much more brutal weapon at my disposal. It was time to take control of the $10 million toxic loan. I could not simply wait for Jonathan to default and let anonymous shadow brokers foreclose on the properties. If I allowed the predatory lenders to handle the liquidation, they would take the profit and quietly erase the family from the neighborhood. That was far too merciful. I needed to be the one holding the leash when the deadline expired. I needed to own the debt so I could personally execute the destruction of their arrogant lives. The corporate battlefield was primed, and it was time for Apex Capital to make its very first move. With Jonathan legally chaining himself to the executive chair and formally assuming every hidden liability of the real estate firm, the defensive phase of my strategy was officially complete. He had confidently locked himself inside a burning building, desperately clutching a paper crown. Now, it was time for me to strike the match. I could not simply sit back and wait for the $10 million toxic loan to default on its own. If I allowed the original shadow lenders to manage the fallout, they would execute the foreclosures, liquidate the family properties, and absorb the massive profits for their own syndicate. That outcome was entirely unacceptable. I did not want anonymous bankers dismantling the lives of the people who had abused me. I needed to hold the leash. I needed to be the undisputed owner of their debt so I could personally deliver the final, devastating blow. I turned my attention to the secure encrypted terminal in my penthouse command center. To purchase a highly distressed commercial loan from a predatory lending group, I could not approach them as Emma Baker. If the lenders discovered that the estranged wife of the newly minted chief executive officer was attempting to buy the company debt, they would instantly smell blood in the water. They would assume I was acting out of desperate sentimentality to save my husband, and they would astronomically inflate the asking price. I needed them to believe they were dealing with a faceless, ruthless corporate vulture. I initiated a secure connection to my proxy corporation, Apex Capital. This anonymous holding company was a pristine financial vessel I had established years ago, funded directly by my hidden New Hampshire trust. On paper, Apex Capital was an aggressive investment firm registered in Delaware, represented by an intimidating wall of high-priced corporate attorneys. There was zero public connection between the holding company and the woman Jonathan had just evicted. To execute the acquisition, I required a broker who thrived in the unregulated shadows of the financial sector. I dialed the direct line of Dominic Thorne. Dominic was a senior distressed debt specialist based in Manhattan. We had collaborated on several hostile liquidations over the past decade. He was a brilliant, calculating negotiator who treated massive asset transfers like a casual game of chess. He did not know my true identity or my relationship to the legendary Victor Baker. He only knew me as a highly lucrative client who possessed infinite capital and impeccable market timing. Dominic answered on the first ring. I bypassed the standard greetings and immediately laid out the parameters of the operation. I instructed him to contact Blackwood Capital, the predatory lending syndicate currently holding Jonathan's $10 million mezzanine loan. I told Dominic to offer a swift cash buyout for the entire debt portfolio, including all attached collateral covenants. The timing was flawlessly calibrated. The executives at Blackwood Capital were already in a state of sheer panic. The commercial lending world is a tight-knit ecosystem, fueled by rapid information, and the scandalous events of our anniversary gala had spread like wildfire. The lenders knew that Theodore had been publicly humiliated regarding missing trust funds. They knew the patriarch had suddenly and suspiciously stepped down from his company. They saw Jonathan frantically filing emergency injunctions to claim the executive title. From a risk assessment perspective, the real estate firm looked incredibly volatile. A $10 million high-interest loan is only valuable if the borrowing entity remains stable. With the company leadership imploding and a massive balloon payment scheduled for Friday, Blackwood Capital was staring down the barrel of a protracted, messy default. I stayed on a muted, secure line while Dominic initiated the conference call with the managing partners at the lending syndicate. I listened silently as the negotiation unfolded. The executives at Blackwood were defensive and highly agitated. They tried to project confidence, insisting the loan was fully secured by prime residential real estate. Dominic effortlessly dismantled their fragile posturing. He casually reminded them that collecting residential collateral across multiple jurisdictions from a highly unstable family undergoing a public meltdown would require years of exhausting litigation. He painted a grim picture of endless court battles, depreciating property values, and massive legal friction. Then Dominic delivered the fatal pitch. He announced that his client, Apex Capital, was willing to absorb the entirety of the legal risk today. He offered them a clean, immediate exit, proposing to buy the toxic paper for a mere fraction of its stated value. The negotiation became a brutal, rapid-fire exchange of financial threats and risk mitigation. Blackwood Capital initially demanded $7 million to release the note. Dominic countered with $2 million, citing the extreme volatility of the new chief executive officer. They haggled aggressively for 30 minutes, but the lenders were ultimately desperate to scrub the toxic asset from their quarterly reports before the Friday deadline. The final purchase price was locked in at $3.5 million. I was securing absolute dominion over my arrogant in-laws for pennies on the dollar. Dominic muted the conference line and confirmed the amount with me. I immediately authorized the transfer. My fingers flew across the keyboard, routing the capital from my hidden trust fund through the encrypted channels of Apex Capital. Within seconds, the wire transfer cleared the federal banking system. The massive injection of cash landed securely in the Blackwood accounts. The digital ink dried on the assignment of debt contracts. The syndicate eagerly relinquished their claim, washing their hands of the mess. Apex Capital was officially the primary secured creditor. I downloaded the newly transferred debt schedules onto my private server, a cold thrill radiating through my chest. I opened the collateral annex to review the exact weapons I had just acquired. The screen illuminated the specific properties Jonathan had secretly pledged to secure the desperate cash. I now legally held the deed of trust for the towering corporate headquarters in downtown Boston. I held the lien on Theodore and Constance's sprawling historic estate. I held the lien on the exclusive gated mansion belonging to Olivia and her husband Nathan. Jonathan had forged his family's signatures to cross-collateralize their homes, arrogantly believing he could flip a quick profit and pay off the loan before anyone noticed. By legally seizing control of the company this morning, he had formally validated those fraudulent liens. He had chained his parents and his sister to the bumper of a runaway train. The dramatic irony of the situation was almost intoxicating. Somewhere in the city, Jonathan was likely sitting behind his father's massive mahogany desk, proudly dictating orders to his administrative staff. He probably believed he was a visionary titan who had successfully starved his wife out of her own home. He was boasting to his mistress about his limitless power, completely oblivious to the fact that the woman he threw onto the curb now owned the very roof over his head. He thought he was preparing to secure a fresh line of credit from traditional banks to cover his Friday balloon payment. He did not realize that every reputable underwriter in the state would reject his applications the moment they saw the chaotic leadership transition. Friday was approaching with terrifying velocity. When the clock struck 5 in the afternoon, and Jonathan inevitably failed to produce $10 million in liquid cash, the grace period would expire. I would be legally authorized to trigger the deadly acceleration clause. I would not need to ask for permission or file a lengthy civil lawsuit. The terms of the predatory loan allowed the primary creditor to bypass standard judicial foreclosure proceedings. I could seize their properties with a single certified letter. The financial noose was perfectly tied, but the sudden severe restriction of corporate cash flow was already beginning to create violent tremors within their toxic ecosystem. Jonathan was so desperate to stockpile capital for his impending loan payment that he had quietly frozen the secondary company expense accounts. Those specific accounts were the exact same funds his sister Olivia relied upon to maintain her lavish artificial lifestyle. As I sat in my penthouse, watching the afternoon shadows lengthen across the harbor, the pressure inside their family was reaching a critical boiling point. The loss of easy money reveals the true nature of selfish people. Olivia was about to discover that her unlimited shopping sprees were officially terminated. Her ensuing panic would force her to turn her vicious entitlement toward the only responsible person left in her orbit, igniting a bitter domestic fracture that would tear their fragile bloodline apart from the inside out. The invisible financial garrote I had wrapped around the real estate firm was already tightening with lethal efficiency. Jonathan was panicking. To stockpile enough liquid cash for his impending Friday balloon payment, he quietly suspended all secondary corporate expense accounts. He did not issue a memo or warn his family members. He simply severed their financial lifelines to save his own skin, attempting to plug a massive hole in his sinking ship. The immediate casualty of this frantic cash hoarding was his sister. Olivia lived in a state of perpetual manufactured luxury. She spent her days floating between exclusive Pilates studios, high-end cosmetic clinics, and champagne luncheons. Her entire identity was inextricably tethered to a platinum corporate card. That afternoon, she was sitting in the private lounge of a premier Boston spa, expecting to effortlessly charge a $5,000 wellness package to her father's company. Instead, the concierge returned with a polite but devastatingly firm smile, informing her the transaction was declined. Olivia snatched the plastic back, her face flushing with indignant rage. She assumed it was a trivial banking error caused by her brother's messy transition to chief executive officer. She stormed out of the spa and drove her luxury sports car directly to her gated mansion, demanding immediate answers. She slammed the heavy mahogany front door open, entering the sprawling foyer. The house was quiet, except for the low murmur of a television in the living room. Her husband Nathan was sitting on the edge of the sofa, rubbing his temples. Nathan was a brilliant, board-certified pediatric oncologist. He spent his grueling 14-hour shifts holding the hands of terrified parents and administering life-saving treatments to critically ill children. He was a man of profound empathy and exhausting dedication. He was also a man who had endured half a decade of relentless, classist insults from his wife's arrogant family. Theodore and Jonathan constantly mocked Nathan behind his back because he chose to save lives rather than exploit real estate loopholes. They viewed his noble profession as quaint and financially inferior because he actually worked for his salary instead of inheriting a fraudulent throne. Olivia did not ask her exhausted husband how his punishing medical shift went. She did not offer him a warm greeting or inquire about their young son who was napping upstairs. She marched directly into the living room and threw her deactivated platinum card onto the glass coffee table. The plastic clattered loudly against the surface, breaking the peaceful atmosphere. "Jonathan locked the corporate accounts!" Olivia shrieked, her voice a shrill, grating pitch that shattered the quiet room. "He is hoarding cash for some ridiculous restructuring deal, and now my cards are frozen. The concierge at the spa looked at me like I was a common peasant. It was utterly humiliating." Nathan looked up, his eyes heavy with the weight of a demanding medical career. He did not match her frantic, hysterical energy. "Your brother is running a failing company, Olivia. The market rumors are everywhere. You need to curb your spending immediately. We have our own household budget to maintain." "Our budget?" Olivia scoffed, waving her manicured hand dismissively. "Your hospital salary barely covers the property taxes on this estate, Nathan. I am not living like a middle-class housewife. Jonathan needs a massive cash injection to stabilize the firm before Friday, and he expects the family to pitch in?" She crossed her arms, tapping her designer heel against the hardwood floor. "I need you to liquidate your retirement portfolios immediately. Cash out your medical pensions and transfer the funds to Jonathan's holding account. Once he secures his new line of credit, he will reimburse us with interest. I am not going to be seen driving a basic car or wearing last season's wardrobe just because my brother is having a temporary liquidity issue." Nathan sat perfectly still. The ambient noise of the television faded entirely into the background. He stared at the woman he had married, hoping to build a genuine partnership. He looked at her furious, flushed face, and the staggering depth of her entitlement finally crystallized in his mind. She did not view him as a partner or a beloved husband. She viewed him merely as a personal, automated teller machine to be drained whenever her fraudulent family required a bailout. She was perfectly willing to burn the financial security he had built, saving dying children, just to ensure she could continue purchasing luxury handbags. The profound realization washed over Nathan like a bucket of ice water. He saw the exact same toxic, rotting core in Olivia that infected Jonathan and Theodore. If he stayed, she would drag him and their young son directly into the catastrophic abyss of a federal bankruptcy. She would poison their child with the exact same narcissistic greed that defined her entire bloodline. He recognized the abuse I had suffered for years and realized he was next on the chopping block. Nathan stood up from the sofa. He did not yell or throw his hands in the air. He operated with the cold, clinical precision of a highly trained surgeon excising a deeply malignant tumor. "I am not liquidating a single cent of my hard-earned savings to bail out a family of arrogant frauds," Nathan stated, his voice carrying a calm, lethal authority. "I am not financing your superficial lifestyle while your brother drives his company into a federal investigation." Olivia gasped, her eyes widening in pure shock. "Excuse me? You owe this family everything. My father gave us the down payment for this house. You are going to do exactly what I tell you." "Your father secretly cross-collateralized this house to secure a toxic loan," Nathan corrected, stepping closer, forcing her to back away. "I received a very interesting phone call this morning from a colleague who monitors the distressed debt markets. Your brother forged signatures to mortgage this entire property. We do not own this mansion, Olivia. It belongs to a shadow lender, and it is going to be foreclosed upon by the end of the week." The color drained completely from Olivia's face. Her mouth opened, but no sound came out. The pristine illusion of her generational wealth was rapidly disintegrating right in front of her eyes. Nathan reached into his leather briefcase resting near the sofa. He pulled out a thick, crisp stack of legal documents securely bound in a heavy blue folder. He extended his arm and pressed the papers firmly against her chest, forcing her to take them. "What is this?" Olivia stammered, looking down at the intimidating legal seal. "Those are expedited emergency divorce papers," Nathan declared, his tone dropping into an icy, unyielding register. "I filed an injunction this morning protecting my medical income and securing my personal assets from your impending bankruptcy. I also filed for full and sole physical custody of our son." Olivia dropped her designer handbag. "You cannot do this to me. You cannot take my child. You have absolutely no independent income and zero moral character to raise a human being," Nathan replied, buttoning his suit jacket with mechanical efficiency. "You view people as disposable accessories. I will never allow you to corrupt his developing mind the way this toxic family corrupted yours." Nathan turned his back on his hyperventilating wife. He walked calmly up the grand staircase. 10 minutes later, he returned, holding his young son securely in his arms, carrying a single travel duffel bag over his shoulder. The boy rested his head against his father's chest, completely insulated from the toxic chaos erupting below. Olivia fell to her knees on the marble floor of the foyer. The thick divorce papers scattered wildly around her shaking body. She unleashed a horrific, blood-curdling shriek that echoed off the vaulted ceilings. She sobbed hysterically, begging Nathan to stay, pleading with him not to abandon her while her family empire collapsed. Nathan did not pause. He did not offer a single word of comfort. He walked out the heavy front doors into the crisp afternoon air, aligning himself morally and financially with the truth. He climbed into his practical sedan and drove away, leaving the ruined, weeping remnants of his marriage behind him forever. Inside the sprawling, quiet mansion, Olivia remained curled on the cold stone floor. Her entire world had been surgically dismantled in a matter of minutes. She was stripped of her husband, her child, her financial security, and her future. But the toxic venom of her upbringing refused to let her accept defeat. Instead of reflecting on her devastating behavior, her narcissistic brain violently rejected the reality of her poverty. She convinced herself that Nathan was simply throwing a pathetic tantrum. She decided she needed to prove to him and to the entire Boston elite that she was still untouchable royalty. Desperate to project an illusion of infinite wealth, she crawled across the floor and grabbed her phone. She dialed her mother, Constance, seeking the only other woman who shared her profound delusion. They would march into the city's most exclusive boutiques tomorrow morning and spend thousands of dollars to prove their supremacy. They were entirely unaware that their credit profiles were already locked in a death spiral, and their impending shopping spree would trigger the most humiliating public social execution of their miserable lives. The morning sun illuminated the historic cobblestone streets of Boston, casting a crisp light over the sprawling mansions and high-end retail districts. Inside her quiet estate, Olivia woke up exactly where she had collapsed the previous afternoon. The cold marble floor offered no comfort, and the thick divorce papers remained scattered around her trembling hands. Her husband was gone. Her son was gone. Her financial security was entirely erased by a devastating legal injunction. But rather than face the terrifying reality of her shattered existence, her deeply ingrained narcissism constructed a desperate alternative narrative. She convinced herself that Nathan was simply throwing a pathetic tantrum. She believed he would return, crawling on his knees, once her brother solidified his control over the family real estate empire. To maintain her fragile sanity, she needed validation. She needed to prove to herself and to the judgmental elite of the city that she remained untouchable royalty. She picked up her phone and dialed her mother. Constance answered with the same toxic artificial cheerfulness that defined their entire bloodline. When Olivia explained the situation, leaving out the terrifying details of the foreclosure and focusing entirely on her husband walking out, Constance offered a chillingly dismissive response. Constance declared that a wealthy, powerful woman did not mourn a disobedient spouse. She instructed her daughter to wash her face, put on her most expensive designer dress, and meet her downtown. They were going to engage in a highly visible display of absolute financial dominance. 2 hours later, Constance and Olivia pushed through the heavy glass doors of the most exclusive boutique on Newbury Street. This was not a standard retail establishment. It was a private sanctuary for the wives of prominent politicians, hedge fund managers, and corporate titans. The air smelled of white tea and exorbitant wealth. Crystal chandeliers hung above velvet display cases, housing rare imported leather goods and custom jewelry. Several influential socialites were already browsing the aisles, sipping sparkling water and speaking in hushed, polite tones. Constance and Olivia did not browse quietly. They entered the space like conquering monarchs intending to dominate the atmosphere. They spoke loudly about Jonathan assuming the role of chief executive officer. They projected a manufactured image of infinite prosperity, grabbing items off the pristine shelves with frantic, aggressive energy. They instructed the eager sales associates to pull matching sets of luxury luggage, limited edition silk gowns, and diamond-encrusted watches. They were purchasing a $50,000 suit of armor to shield themselves from the whispers of their impending ruin. The boutique manager, a sharply dressed man named Julian, watched them with a practiced, accommodating smile. He guided them toward the private checkout counter located in the center of the showroom, ensuring every other wealthy patron could witness the massive transaction. Constance leaned against the polished marble counter, flashing a brilliant fake smile at a nearby senator's wife. She wanted the entire city to know that her family possessed unlimited capital. The manager tallied the exorbitant total. Constance casually opened her crocodile skin handbag and retrieved her heavy titanium corporate credit card. She placed it onto a silver tray with a loud, authoritative clack. The manager inserted the heavy metal card into the encrypted payment terminal. The boutique fell entirely silent, anticipating the approval chime. Instead, the machine emitted a harsh, piercing electronic blare. A bright red warning flashed across the digital display. Declined. The sharp sound echoed violently through the quiet showroom. The wealthy socialites stopped browsing. They turned their heads, their eyes locking onto Constance and Olivia with sudden predatory interest. In their hyper-competitive circle, a declined credit card was the ultimate mark of shame. It was a public declaration of financial death. Constance felt the blood drain from her face. Her artificial smile faltered slightly, but she quickly recovered, masking her rising panic with indignant rage. She slammed her hand against the marble counter. She loudly accused the manager of operating a faulty machine. She demanded he run the transaction again, blaming a temporary fraud hold caused by her massive wealth. The manager maintained his professional composure. He ran the titanium card a second time. The machine blared the exact same harsh rejection. Constance snatched the card away, her hands shaking violently. She dug into her handbag and pulled out 3 different personal credit cards, throwing them onto the silver tray. She ordered the manager to split the transaction, assuming one of her secondary accounts would clear the massive balance. The manager processed each card meticulously. Every single transaction yielded the exact same result. The accounts were entirely locked. The financial freeze I had orchestrated through Apex Capital had successfully suffocated their entire cash flow. The atmosphere in the boutique shifted from polite curiosity to delicious, unadulterated horror. The elite women in the room began whispering behind their manicured hands, exchanging knowing glances. News of Theodore stepping down and the family facing severe liquidity issues had already begun circulating through the country club gossip network. This public humiliation was the absolute confirmation of their total ruin. The manager stepped back from the terminal. His accommodating smile vanished, completely replaced by a cold, firm expression of disdain. He picked up the useless plastic cards and handed them back to Constance. He informed her in a loud, clear voice that her financial institutions had completely suspended her purchasing power. He stated that the boutique did not offer lines of credit to high-risk individuals. He then gestured directly toward the heavy glass doors, asking them to vacate the premises immediately to avoid disrupting the actual paying clients. Olivia let out a high-pitched gasp, covering her mouth with her trembling hands. Constance turned a deep, violent shade of purple. She attempted to shout another threat, claiming she would buy the entire building and fire the manager. But her words rang hollow against the deafening silence of the judging crowd. The social execution was absolute. 2 security guards stepped forward, placing their hands firmly on the small of their backs, physically escorting the disgraced women out of the sanctuary. They were shoved onto the busy sidewalk, banished from high society forever. While Constance and Olivia were being publicly exiled, another silent, devastating betrayal was unfolding inside my former marital estate. Alyssa, the shiny new mistress Jonathan had proudly paraded on social media, was lounging by the indoor pool. She was drinking expensive champagne and enjoying the luxurious lifestyle she believed she had successfully stolen. Alyssa was not a supportive partner willing to stand by a man during difficult times. She was a highly calculated predator who traded affection for financial security. She opened her laptop, intending to book a lavish tropical vacation to celebrate her new position as the lady of the house. She entered the details of the secondary corporate credit card Jonathan had given her that morning. She clicked confirm, expecting a seamless transaction. The booking portal flashed a stark warning. The payment was unequivocally rejected. Alyssa frowned, setting her champagne glass aside. She accessed the primary banking application on Jonathan's personal tablet, which he had carelessly left unlocked on the kitchen counter. She navigated to the main dashboard to investigate the issue. The numbers displayed on the screen made her breath hitch in her throat. The primary checking accounts were frozen. The corporate expense lines were suspended. Every single domestic asset was locked tight. Her sharp mind worked rapidly, processing the catastrophic data. She read the incoming legal emails Jonathan had ignored while popping champagne. She saw the automated notices regarding the defaulted $10 million toxic loan. She recognized the catastrophic warning signs of an impending federal raid. Jonathan was not a rising corporate titan. He was a sinking anchor, about to be dragged to the bottom of the ocean. Alyssa did not panic. She did not feel a single ounce of loyalty or sorrow for the man who had just blown up his marriage to be with her. She operated with pure survival instinct. She navigated deeper into the tablet, accessing a hidden encrypted folder. During their illicit affair, Jonathan had foolishly bragged to her about an offshore cryptocurrency cache he kept for extreme emergencies. He wanted to impress her with his financial cunning, entirely unaware that he was handing a loaded weapon to a mercenary. Alyssa executed a password reset using his active email terminal. She breached the offshore cache holding over $500,000 in untraceable digital currency. With a few swift, methodical keystrokes, she transferred the entirety of the emergency funds directly into her own private overseas account. The screen flashed a bright green confirmation message. The digital vault was completely emptied. She calmly closed the tablet and walked upstairs to the master bedroom. She pulled her designer overnight bags from the closet and meticulously packed her belongings. She did not leave a sentimental goodbye note. She did not offer a single word of explanation. Alyssa simply walked out the front door, climbed into her waiting rideshare, and vanished into the bustling city, wiping Jonathan from her memory forever. Hours later, Jonathan returned to the estate. He was completely exhausted, his mind racing with the terrifying reality of the defaulted loan. He walked through the grand foyer, calling out for his mistress, hoping to find a warm embrace to soothe his fractured ego. He was met with absolute suffocating silence. He walked into the kitchen and saw his abandoned tablet. He opened the screen and discovered the emptied offshore accounts. His heart slammed violently against his ribs as the horrific truth materialized. His wife had outsmarted him. His father had failed him, his sister was a financial liability, and the mistress he had sacrificed everything for had just robbed him blind and fled into the night. Jonathan fell to his knees on the cold hardwood floor, completely and utterly isolated. He was stripped of his money, his family, and his pride. He was drowning in a sea of toxic debt, staring directly into the terrifying void of a federal prison sentence. He was absolutely desperate, willing to sell his soul to anyone who offered a lifeline. He was perfectly primed for the final, devastating trap I had waiting for him the very next morning. Friday morning broke over Boston with a cruel, blinding clarity. Inside the sprawling marital estate, Jonathan sat completely alone, staring at the digital clock on his kitchen counter. The glowing red numbers mocked his absolute isolation. The offshore emergency cash was entirely drained by a mercenary mistress who had vanished into the night like smoke. His sister Olivia was likely weeping in her foreclosed mansion, and his disgraced father Theodore was hiding from terrified investors. But the most terrifying reality hovering over Jonathan was the clock striking 9. The absolute deadline for the $10 million balloon payment had officially arrived. He possessed zero liquid capital to transfer. The grace period expired, instantly transforming the toxic mezzanine loan into an active, unrecoverable default. Jonathan felt the cold, crushing weight of federal prison pressing against his ribs. He had legally bound himself to the executive chair, assuming full fiduciary responsibility for massive tax fraud and predatory debt. He poured a glass of cheap bourbon, his hand shaking so violently the amber liquid spilled across the granite countertop. He was waiting for the inevitable phone call from a ruthless shadow lender demanding the keys to his entire life. The silence in the massive house was deafening, amplifying his racing heartbeat. He paced the hardwood floors, checking his email terminal every 30 seconds, anticipating the formal notice of foreclosure. Instead of a legal death warrant, his inbox chimed with a highly encrypted message from a domain he did not recognize. The sender was listed as the senior managing director of Apex Capital. Jonathan frowned, rubbing his bloodshot eyes. He clicked the bold subject line and opened the attached document. It was a formal term sheet proposing a comprehensive corporate bailout. His exhausted brain struggled to process the sheer magnitude of the text. The proposal outlined a massive injection of fresh capital specifically targeting the stabilization of their commercial real estate portfolios. Furthermore, the mysterious billionaire proxy explicitly offered to absorb the $10 million defaulted loan, protecting the family assets from immediate seizure. The most intoxicating clause, however, was buried in the executive structuring section. Apex Capital insisted that Jonathan remain in his newly acquired role as Chief Executive Officer, citing a desire for leadership continuity. The faceless Wall Street titan praised his bold vision and aggressive market strategies. The syndicate wanted to elevate his firm, transforming a regional enterprise into a global powerhouse. Jonathan dropped his glass. It shattered against the kitchen tiles, but he did not flinch. A wild, manic euphoria surged through his veins, entirely overriding his previous despair. He let out a breathless, hysterical laugh that echoed through the empty estate. The universe was rewarding his genius. He firmly believed his sheer brilliance had attracted a legendary investment syndicate willing to sweep away his father's incompetent mistakes. The red herring functioned flawlessly. The term sheet was a perfectly engineered psychological weapon designed to reinflate his colossal ego right before the final slaughter. He swallowed the bait without an ounce of hesitation. Intoxicated by the sudden reversal of fortune, Jonathan immediately retrieved his smartphone. His first instinct was not to call his lawyers or verify the authenticity of the term sheet. His narcissistic obsession demanded he exact petty revenge against the woman he believed he had successfully discarded. He opened his message thread with me, his fingers flying across the digital keyboard with vindictive glee. He typed that he had just secured the biggest financial deal in the history of the city, sending the text into the digital ether. He bragged that a Wall Street titan was buying out the debt and making him a legitimate billionaire today. They specifically requested that he stay in charge because they recognized true talent. His company was about to dominate the entire eastern seaboard. He cruelly added his hopes that I was enjoying the complimentary breakfast at whatever homeless shelter I slept in last night. He claimed I threw away a golden ticket because I was too stupid to trust his vision and wished me a nice life serving coffee to people like him. Miles away, inside my secure penthouse command center, I read the glowing text message on my monitor. A cold, genuine smile touched my lips. Jonathan was bragging to his executioner about the very guillotine she had constructed for his neck. He was so completely detached from reality that he believed a mysterious billionaire was rewarding his fraudulent business practices out of sheer admiration. I did not type a single character in response. The suffocating silence would let his delusion peak perfectly. I locked the screen and turned my attention back to the final preparations. The board was set for the ultimate corporate slaughter. Back in the city, Jonathan called his father, pulling Theodore out of a deep, depressive state. When the disgraced patriarch heard about the Apex Capital term sheet, he wept tears of profound relief. The two men raced downtown to their historic commercial headquarters. This massive building was the crown jewel of their fraudulent empire, located right in the heart of the financial district. The towering structure featured imported Italian marble floors, vaulted glass ceilings, and a sweeping mahogany staircase that symbolized decades of their family's manufactured supremacy. Theodore and Jonathan ordered their panicked administrative staff to completely halt all normal business operations. They mandated a chaotic, frantic cleanup of the grand lobby. Janitors polished the brass fixtures until they gleamed, while assistants unrolled an actual plush red carpet from the revolving doors all the way to the private executive elevator bank. They demanded absolute perfection, aiming to project an image of unshakable wealth to their billionaire savior. The entire board of directors was summoned for an emergency reception. Dozens of elderly, wealthy investors gathered in the lobby holding crystal flutes of expensive champagne. They murmured anxiously amongst themselves, utterly terrified by the week of negative press, but desperately hoping this mysterious proxy would rescue their sinking portfolios. Jonathan stood at the absolute center of the room, basking in their desperate attention. He wore a brand-new, bespoke charcoal suit, projecting the false aura of a conquering king. Theodore stood slightly behind him, sweating profusely through his collar, his hands clasped tightly together in a posture of eager submission. The grandfather clock in the corner of the lobby chimed, striking the designated meeting hour. The bustling, nervous chatter of the elite crowd abruptly died down as a fleet of heavy vehicles pulled up to the curb outside the glass facade. Through the transparent walls, Jonathan could see three massive, matte black armored sport utility vehicles gliding to a synchronized halt. The imposing presence of the motorcade radiated a terrifying, limitless authority that commanded the entire street. Jonathan puffed out his chest, adjusting his silk tie one final time. He plastered a sycophantic, desperate smile onto his face, fully prepared to bow down and grovel at the feet of the Wall Street titan who held his financial life in their hands. Theodore mirrored his son's posture, practically vibrating with eager anticipation. They were ready to surrender their dignity in exchange for a continuous flow of stolen wealth. The heavy, reinforced doors of the lead vehicle swung open. The lobby held its collective breath. The revolving glass entrance began to spin. Instead of a lone executive in a business suit walking through the doors, a squad of towering private security contractors stepped into the building. They wore immaculate tactical uniforms, moving with a synchronized lethal precision that instantly drained the celebratory atmosphere from the room. The armed men fanned out, securing the perimeter of the lobby and completely blocking the main exits. The crystal champagne flutes trembled in the hands of the terrified board members. The red carpet suddenly looked less like a pathway for royalty and more like a trail leading directly to an execution chamber. Jonathan felt his arrogant smile falter slightly, his brain struggling to comprehend the aggressive military-style entrance. This did not look like a standard corporate acquisition. This looked like a hostile invasion. Then, a new sound pierced the stifling silence of the grand marble hall. It was the sharp, heavy echo of measured tactical footsteps striding purposefully down the corridor, followed by the distinct, unmistakable click of stiletto heels striking the polished stone. The rhythmic sound grew louder, moving closer to the grand archway of the main reception area. Someone possessing absolute, unquestioned dominion over the entire situation was approaching the red carpet. Jonathan swallowed hard, his palms suddenly slick with cold sweat as the shadowy figures finally stepped into the brilliant light of the lobby, ready to completely shatter his entire fraudulent universe. The executive boardroom on the top floor of the corporate headquarters was a monument to manufactured prestige. A massive obsidian glass table dominated the center of the room, surrounded by panoramic windows offering a sweeping view of the Boston skyline. Jonathan had hastily relocated the emergency reception from the main lobby to this private sanctuary, believing it provided a more intimate setting to finalize his billion-dollar bailout. The elderly board of directors took their seats nervously, clutching their leather portfolios. Theodore stood near the entrance, pacing frantically while smoothing the lapels of his expensive suit. They were all holding their collective breath, waiting for the mysterious savior from Apex Capital to walk through the threshold and rescue their fraudulent legacy. The heavy oak doors of the boardroom suddenly swung open with a resounding thud that echoed sharply against the glass walls. The anxious chatter among the board members died instantly. The tactical security contractors who had secured the lobby marched into the room first, forming a tight, impenetrable perimeter around the entrance. They moved with a synchronized military efficiency that completely paralyzed the corporate executives. Following closely behind the armed guards, a single imposing figure stepped into the bright morning light of the executive suite. Victor Baker radiated a terrifying, relentless Wall Street authority. The rugged flannel jacket and scuffed boots he wore on the night of the gala were entirely gone. In their place, he wore a flawless, bespoke charcoal suit that draped perfectly across his broad shoulders, projecting an aura of absolute, limitless power. His silver hair was impeccably styled, and his sharp, predatory eyes swept over the terrified board members with clinical detachment. He looked like a man who dismantled global conglomerates for sport. Theodore practically tripped over his own feet, rushing forward to greet the Titan. The disgraced patriarch was sweating profusely, his face stretched into a painfully desperate, sycophantic smile. He extended both of his trembling hands, bowing his head in a pathetic display of total submission. Theodore completely failed to recognize the billionaire standing before him. His deeply ingrained classism and desperate greed entirely blinded him to the truth. He could not comprehend that the magnificent corporate kingpin he was currently groveling before was the exact same New Hampshire lumberjack he had relentlessly mocked and degraded in front of 600 elite guests just a few days prior. "Thank you so much for coming, sir," Theodore gushed, his voice cracking with eager desperation. "I am the founder of this enterprise, and we are profoundly honored by your presence today. We have all the restructuring contracts ready for your signature. You are making the greatest investment of the decade." Victor did not extend his hand to accept the greeting. He did not smile. He looked down at the sweating, trembling patriarch with an expression of pure, unfiltered disgust. He treated Theodore as if he were an unpleasant stain on the polished marble floor. Without uttering a single word, Victor deliberately stepped aside, clearing the pathway through the heavy oak doors. The rhythmic, sharp click of stiletto heels striking the hardwood floor echoed from the corridor. The sound was measured, confident, and deadly. I walked into the grand boardroom, completely shattering the suffocating silence of the room. I was no longer the quiet, unassuming woman from the rugged mountains who wore plain sweaters to avoid bruising my husband's fragile ego. I was fully armored in a $5,000 midnight blue tailored suit that fit with razor-sharp precision. A pristine white silk blouse contrasted fiercely against the dark fabric. The signature blood-red soles of my Louboutin heels flashed brilliantly with every deliberate step I took into the corporate sanctuary. The cognitive dissonance hit Theodore and Jonathan with the devastating force of a physical blow. Their arrogant minds violently rejected the image materializing right in front of their eyes. Jonathan stumbled backward, his hip crashing harshly into the edge of the obsidian glass table. The color drained entirely from his face, leaving a sickly, chalky pallor. He stared at my expensive tailored suit. He stared at my confident, unwavering posture. He stared at the terrifying armed contractors who respectfully parted ways to allow me unobstructed passage. The mathematical impossibility of his evicted, destitute wife walking shoulder to shoulder with a billionaire investment proxy caused a massive psychological short-circuit in Jonathan. He frantically tried to rationalize the terrifying scene. His narcissistic brain concluded that I must have somehow bypassed the building security to stage a hysterical public breakdown and ruin his massive financial triumph.
"What the hell are you doing here?"
Jonathan roared, his voice cracking with unhinged panic as he pointed a shaking finger directly at my face. He looked wildly around the room, trying to salvage his precious reputation in front of the horrified board of directors.
"Security!"
he bellowed at the top of his lungs.
"Get in here right now and drag this crazy woman out of my building. She is my delusional ex-wife and she is having a severe mental breakdown because I threw her out on the street. Grab her immediately before she bothers our investor for another second."
Two corporate building guards, who had been standing nervously in the corner, took a hesitant step forward, responding to the frantic commands of their newly self-appointed chief executive. They reached their hands out, preparing to physically grab my arms and haul me out of the boardroom. They never made it within 5 feet of my tailored jacket. The tactical security contractors moved with blinding, lethal speed. They stepped smoothly in front of me, forming an impenetrable human wall of black fabric and raw physical dominance. In perfect unison, the elite bodyguards reached under their jackets. The sharp mechanical click of heavy-duty stun guns being drawn and activated ripped through the air. The bright blue electrical arcs crackled fiercely, sending a harsh, intimidating buzzing sound echoing off the panoramic windows. The two corporate guards instantly froze, raising their hands in immediate, absolute surrender. Retreating rapidly into the shadows, the entire boardroom plunged into a stunned, paralyzed silence. The elderly board members clutched their briefcases, staring with wide, terrified eyes at the armed men actively protecting me. Jonathan stood frozen at the edge of the table, his outstretched arm falling limply to his side. His breathing became shallow and ragged as the horrifying reality began to slowly fracture his impenetrable delusion. He looked at Victor, hoping the billionaire would condemn my intrusion. Victor simply folded his arms across his chest, standing firmly behind me like an immovable granite mountain. I did not raise my voice or acknowledge Jonathan's pathetic screaming. I walked with elegant, terrifying grace past the trembling patriarch and the paralyzed board members. I moved directly toward the head of the massive obsidian glass table. This was the traditional seat of power, the exact throne Jonathan had aggressively claimed to prove his ultimate supremacy. I pulled the heavy leather executive chair back and sat down. I smoothed the crisp fabric of my trousers and crossed my legs with supreme, undeniable authority. I rested my forearms gracefully on the cool glass surface, leaning forward to survey the room. I looked directly into Jonathan's horrified, bloodshot eyes, watching the final remnants of his fake empire crumble into dust. Jonathan stared at me, his jaw trembling uncontrollably. He tried to speak, attempting to formulate an apology or a demand, but his vocal cords were completely paralyzed by the sheer magnitude of his miscalculation. "You are incredibly confused, Jonathan," I stated, my voice carrying a cheerful, deadly clarity that sliced through the heavy tension of the room. "You believe this man standing beside me is your financial savior. You believe he is the mysterious Wall Street titan who authorized the term sheet to rescue your rotting commercial real estate firm." I paused, letting the terrible silence stretch, allowing the dread to saturate every single corner of the executive suite. Theodore grabbed the back of a nearby chair, gasping for air as his chest heaved violently. "Allow me to clarify the corporate structure for you," I continued, keeping my gaze locked onto my trembling ex-husband. "This man is Victor Baker. He is my father. He controls a $50 billion global private equity syndicate, but he does not manage the day-to-day operations of distressed debt acquisitions. He is not the chief executive officer of Apex Capital." I leaned back in the heavy leather chair, resting my hands on the polished armrests, projecting absolute, total dominion over their entire existence. "I am—" The collective gasp from the board of directors sucked all the remaining oxygen out of the massive room. Jonathan collapsed into a nearby chair, as if his knees had been physically shattered. The devastating realization finally crashed down upon him, obliterating his entire universe. The quiet, unassuming woman he had slapped, evicted, and mercilessly degraded was the undisputed apex predator, holding the absolute power of life and death over his entire bloodline. He had voluntarily locked himself inside a burning building, and the woman holding the only key was sitting right in front of him, completely ready to strike the match. The suffocating silence in the executive boardroom stretched into an agonizing eternity. I did not raise my voice or shout to assert my dominance. In the high-stakes environment of corporate slaughter, silence is the most terrifying weapon a predator can wield. I sat comfortably in the heavy leather chair that Jonathan had so eagerly claimed for himself just days ago. I watched his hyperventilating chest heave under his expensive tailored suit. The arrogant man who had slapped me across the face in front of hundreds of people was now shaking so violently that his knees visibly knocked together. Theodore stood paralyzed near the edge of the obsidian glass table, clutching his chest as if his heart was actively failing him. The elderly board of directors remained frozen in their seats, entirely unable to comprehend how the submissive New Hampshire woman they had always ignored was now commanding a $50 billion global syndicate. I reached into the pocket of my midnight blue blazer and retrieved a sleek silver remote control. I aimed the device at the far wall and pressed a single button. The massive, opaque glass panels surrounding the boardroom instantly digitized. The luxurious view of the Boston skyline vanished entirely, replaced by enormous, high-definition display screens. The entire room was suddenly bathed in a harsh, glowing blue light, as millions of rows of complex financial data cascaded across the walls. I had breached their highly encrypted shadow servers days ago, and now I was projecting their absolute ruin for everyone to witness. The board members gasped in unison, scrambling to put on their reading glasses. They squinted at the glowing spreadsheets, and the color rapidly drained from their wealthy faces. What you are looking at is the unredacted financial autopsy of your supposedly thriving real estate firm, I announced, my voice carrying a crisp, deadly clarity that echoed off the digital glass. For years, Theodore and Jonathan projected an illusion of untouchable prosperity. They hosted lavish galas and bragged about their visionary developments. But those developments were nothing more than ghost properties and fraudulent zoning schemes. I directed their attention to a specific cluster of offshore routing numbers, highlighted in bright red on the primary monitor. I detailed how Jonathan had been systematically stealing millions of dollars in federal employee tax withholdings. He did not pay the government. He quietly siphoned the hard-earned money of his administrative staff and construction workers, routing the capital through dummy corporations. He used federal funds to lease luxury sports cars and buy expensive jewelry for his mistress while lecturing me about financial responsibility. The wealthy investors around the table began to murmur in unadulterated horror, realizing that their own capital was deeply entangled in a massive federal crime scene. Jonathan tried to speak, but his throat was completely dry. He stammered a pathetic denial, claiming the numbers were fabricated, but his voice lacked any conviction. I did not even look at him as I pressed the remote again, shifting the display to the most devastating document of all. The screen flashed with the unmistakable letterhead of a highly predatory shadow lending syndicate. I explained that Jonathan was bleeding cash so rapidly that he sought out a $10 million toxic mezzanine loan to keep the lights on. The board members read the astronomical interest rates and the brutal acceleration clauses, causing them to physically recoil in their chairs. But the true horror was buried in the collateral annex. I highlighted the specific residential assets Jonathan had pledged to secure the desperate cash injection. Theodore let out a strangled, agonizing wheeze as his primary address flashed across the massive screen. He recognized the property instantly. It was his sprawling historic estate located in the most exclusive suburb of the city. Theodore had spent his entire life curating that mansion to project an image of generational old money. He treated that house like a sacred temple of elitism. Jonathan had secretly forged his father's signature on a blank surety bond, cross-collateralizing the historic estate without Theodore ever knowing. But the betrayals did not end there. I highlighted the second address on the collateral schedule. It was the heavily guarded luxury mansion belonging to his sister, Olivia. Olivia spent her days floating through expensive boutiques and treating service workers like garbage, completely dependent on her manufactured wealth. Jonathan had forged her signature as well, tying her extravagant home directly to his toxic corporate debt. He had secretly mortgaged his entire family to buy himself a few more months of pretending to be a financial genius. Theodore stumbled forward, resting his trembling hands on the glass table to keep from collapsing completely. He looked at his son with eyes full of pure, unfiltered hatred. He realized that the boy he had groomed to inherit the throne was actually the architect of their total familial destruction. I pressed the remote one final time, pulling up Jonathan's entire professional history. I mathematically proved to the board of directors that Jonathan had never successfully closed a single legitimate commercial deal in his life. Every promotion, every massive bonus, and every accolade he had ever received was funded by stolen employee money and predatory debt. His entire career was a spectacularly manufactured lie. He was not a corporate titan. He was an incompetent parasite who survived purely by draining the resources of everyone around him. The fragile illusion of his supremacy shattered into a million jagged pieces. The overwhelming weight of his public exposure finally crushed his narcissistic mind. Jonathan let out a high-pitched, pathetic wail and fell heavily to his knees on the polished marble floor. He completely abandoned any remaining shred of his dignity. He crawled frantically around the edge of the obsidian table, dragging his bespoke suit across the ground until he reached my feet. He looked up at me with red, bloodshot eyes, tears streaming rapidly down his pale face. He begged me for mercy, using a trembling voice that sounded like a frightened child. He weaponized his fake tears, claiming he was suffering from extreme financial stress and mental exhaustion. He swore that he always loved me and promised to be a devoted, faithful husband if I just gave him one more chance to prove his worth. He pleaded with me to tear up the documents and use my massive trust fund to pay off the toxic loan so they could start over as a happy family. I looked down at the sniveling, miserable creature groveling at my red-soled heels. I felt absolutely zero empathy. My heart was a fortress of solid ice. This was the exact same man who had violently slapped me across the face while 600 people laughed at my pain. This was the man who had evicted me and paraded his mistress around my home, believing I would freeze to death in a homeless shelter. I stood up slowly, kicking his desperate hands away from my ankles. I reached into my leather portfolio and pulled out a thick stack of heavy legal documents bound in red tape. I dropped them directly onto the center of the glass table. The heavy thud silenced his pathetic sobbing instantly. I announced that those were not bailout contracts. I told him I did not come to the boardroom to sign a rescue agreement. I informed him that my proxy firm, Apex Capital, had legally purchased the $10 million toxic loan from the Shadowlenders 2 days ago. I was now the undisputed primary secured creditor. And because he had missed the balloon payment that very morning, the loan was officially in active default. I stated clearly that the papers on the table were formal notices of immediate foreclosure. I was not there to save their empire. I was there to execute the immediate, total seizure of the corporate headquarters. I was there to foreclose on Theodore's historic estate. I was there to seize Olivia's luxury mansion. They were entirely stripped of their assets, their status, and their homes. They were legally, unequivocally destitute. I stared at the broken men in front of me, savoring the total destruction of their toxic hierarchy. I reminded Jonathan that he had arrogantly rushed to the courthouse just 48 hours ago to file an emergency assumption of liabilities. He had been so desperate to steal the chief executive title that he legally bound himself to the company without conducting a single audit. I explained that by voluntarily putting his signature on that federal document, he had personally guaranteed the $10 million toxic loan and the massive tax fraud. He had locked himself inside a burning cage and proudly swallowed the only key. The board members who had been ready to praise him earlier now looked at him with sheer, unadulterated disgust. They realized their investments were entirely gone, swallowed by his incompetence and deceit. The wealthy executives slowly backed away from the table, distancing themselves from the radioactive fallout of the family. Jonathan tried to reach out to them, begging his former colleagues for legal help or a character reference, but they simply turned their backs on him, leaving him entirely isolated on the cold marble floor. Theodore collapsed into a chair, weeping openly as his life work evaporated. Jonathan remained frozen on the floor, his mind entirely broken by the sheer magnitude of his absolute ruin. I picked up my leather portfolio and turned my back on my ex-husband. I stood shoulder to shoulder with my father Victor, who nodded with profound, silent approval. We had completely dismantled a corrupt dynasty without raising our voices. The financial execution was flawless and irreversible. They had nothing left to leverage and nowhere left to run. The trap had sprung with perfect, lethal precision, and the consequences were about to become intensely physical as a faint but rapidly growing sound pierced the thick glass windows of the boardroom. The sharp wail of approaching sirens sliced through the suffocating atmosphere inside the executive suite. Initially, the sound was merely a faint, mechanical scream echoing across the Boston skyline. However, within seconds, that distant noise multiplied, escalating into a deafening roar that vibrated fiercely against the panoramic glass windows. The rhythmic flashing of red and blue emergency lights illuminated the terrified faces of the gathered corporate directors, casting eerie shadows across the polished obsidian table. Jonathan remained paralyzed on his knees, his bloodshot eyes darting frantically toward the floor-to-ceiling windows. His breath hitched violently in his throat as the realization of his impending doom finally broke through his fractured delusion. He looked up at me desperately, searching my expression for any sign of a bluff. He found nothing but glacial resolve. I leaned forward, resting my palms flat against the cool glass surface. I informed the panicking executives that the converging authorities were not responding to a minor civil dispute or a standard regulatory inquiry. I explained that exactly 48 hours ago, I had compiled the complete, unredacted ledgers detailing the stolen employee payroll taxes. Utilizing my specialized credentials as a senior mergers and acquisitions auditor, I bypassed typical bureaucratic delays. I securely transmitted the undeniable proof of their massive financial crimes directly to the Criminal Investigation Division of the Federal Bureau of Investigation. The wealthy board members scrambled away from the center of the room, clutching their briefcases and pressing themselves against the far walls. They desperately wanted to distance themselves from the radioactive epicenter of the disgraced family. Theodore staggered backward, his chest heaving rapidly as the gravity of my statement crushed the last remaining breath from his lungs. He understood the lethal efficiency of the federal government. He knew that stealing millions of dollars from honest employees was an unforgivable felony that guaranteed decades in a maximum security penitentiary. Before Jonathan could even attempt to stammer out a pathetic denial, the heavy oak doors of the boardroom burst inward with explosive kinetic energy. A swarm of armed agents wearing dark tactical windbreakers flooded the luxurious space. They moved with terrifying synchronized precision, shouting forceful commands and instantly securing the perimeter. The chaotic noise of barking orders and heavy boots striking the marble floor completely shattered the manufactured prestige of the corporate sanctuary. The lead investigator, a stern woman with eyes like chipped ice, marched directly toward the head of the table. She brandished a thick stack of federal arrest warrants, demanding absolute compliance. In that exact moment, the true rotting core of their elite bloodline was exposed for the entire world to witness. Theodore was a man who had spent 4 decades crushing business rivals, evicting vulnerable tenants, and worshiping his own supreme authority. A narcissist of his magnitude possesses absolutely zero loyalty to anyone other than himself. Faced with the terrifying prospect of dying in a concrete cell, the patriarch made a swift, ruthless calculation. Theodore threw his hands high into the air, backing away from his son, as if Jonathan were carrying a deadly plague. He pointed a trembling, manicured finger directly at the kneeling man. "He orchestrated everything," Theodore shrieked, his voice cracking with pathetic, unhinged cowardice. "My son forged those loan documents. I had absolutely no knowledge of the offshore shadow accounts or the tax evasion. He acted entirely alone to fund his disgusting mistresses. Please, you have to believe me. I will cooperate fully with your investigation. I will testify against him in court. Just give me a plea deal." The utter silence that followed his treacherous outburst was heavier than gravity. Jonathan remained frozen on the carpet, his mouth hanging open in grotesque horror. The father he had blindly worshipped, the man whose toxic approval he had sought his entire miserable life, had just ruthlessly offered him up as a sacrificial lamb to the federal authorities. The ultimate betrayal did not come from an outside competitor. It came from his own flesh and blood. The profound psychological shock completely annihilated whatever remained of Jonathan's sanity. He let out a ragged, guttural sob that tore painfully from his throat. Hot tears streamed down his pale cheeks as 2 towering federal agents hauled him roughly to his feet. They wrenched his arms behind his back, securing his wrists. The sharp, metallic click of the cold steel handcuffs ratcheting tightly into place echoed like a judge striking a final gavel. The arrogant vice president who had violently slapped me across the face just days prior was now a weeping, broken criminal facing a lifetime behind bars. The agents read Jonathan his Miranda rights loudly, ensuring every syllable landed with devastating finality. They listed the severe charges, including aggravated wire fraud, systemic tax evasion, and corporate conspiracy. Jonathan did not argue. He hung his head, sobbing uncontrollably as the authorities forcefully marched him toward the exit. Theodore was handcuffed immediately afterward, his desperate pleas for immunity completely ignored by the stoic investigators. My father Victor stood quietly near the panoramic windows, watching the spectacular downfall of his enemies with a cold, satisfied expression. He gave me a subtle nod of profound respect, acknowledging the flawless execution of my financial slaughter. We followed the swarm of law enforcement agents out of the suite, taking the private elevator down to the main lobby. When the silver doors parted on the ground floor, the chaotic scene unfolding before us perfectly encapsulated their total ruin. The grand marble lobby, which had been meticulously polished and adorned with a red carpet for their imaginary billionaire savior, was now completely overrun by law enforcement. Constance and Olivia were standing near the security turnstiles, surrounded by stern officers. The agents had already swept the lower executive offices, confiscating corporate assets and freezing every active terminal. The two arrogant socialites, who had spent their entire lives treating working-class citizens like disposable garbage, were enduring the ultimate humiliation. Their expensive designer handbags and diamond jewelry had been seized as evidence of funds purchased with stolen capital. Instead of clutching their signature luxury accessories, Constance and Olivia were holding cheap, flimsy cardboard boxes. The boxes contained the pathetic, meaningless remnants of their desk trinkets and personal effects. Olivia's face was blotchy and red from hysterical crying, while Constance stared blankly ahead, her artificial aristocratic posture entirely deflated. They looked like terrified, hollow shells, completely stripped of the unearned wealth that had previously defined their entire existence. The federal marshals herded the entire disgraced family toward the revolving glass doors. I stood near the reception desk, watching them shuffle forward in a miserable, pathetic line. They were pushed out of their towering commercial headquarters and forced into the crisp, biting air of the Boston street. The scene outside the building was an absolute media circus. News of the massive federal raid targeting the city's most prominent real estate dynasty had leaked to the press hours ago. Dozens of local and national television crews had swarmed the sidewalks, setting up heavy cameras and aggressive lighting rigs. A chaotic mob of reporters surged against the police barricades, shouting rapid-fire questions and shoving microphones toward the shattered family. Bright camera flashes exploded continuously, capturing the spectacular public destruction of the elite bloodline. The evening news broadcasts would feature high-definition footage of Jonathan weeping in steel handcuffs right alongside images of Theodore, desperately trying to hide his face from the blinding lights. Constance and Olivia, clutching their pathetic cardboard boxes, would be broadcast into the living rooms of every wealthy socialite they had ever insulted. Their social execution was entirely permanent. The elite circles they desperately worshipped would immediately erase their names from every country club registry and charity gala guest list. They were radioactive pariahs, permanently exiled from high society, facing unimaginable legal debts and decades in a federal penitentiary. The empire they built on arrogance, cruelty, and fraud was reduced to a pile of toxic rubble in the span of a single morning. I watched the heavily armored transport vans pull away from the curb, their blaring sirens fading into the chaotic noise of the city traffic. The heavy, suffocating burden of the past 5 years completely vanished from my shoulders. The war was decisively won, I had systematically dismantled my abusers, leaving them with absolutely nothing but the crushing reality of their own horrific choices. However, the task of clearing the ashes and building something beautiful upon the granite foundation of my true identity still remained ahead of me. 6 months have passed since the flashing red and blue emergency lights illuminated the Boston skyline, leaving a trail of absolute ruin in their wake. Today, the atmosphere surrounding my life is defined by a profound, unshakable peace. I stood on the expansive wraparound balcony of my private estate, nestled deep within the rugged white mountains of New Hampshire. The crisp, biting autumn air filled my lungs, carrying the fresh scent of pine needles and damp earth. This natural environment was a stark, beautiful contrast to the sterile, suffocating penthouses and fake corporate sanctuaries of my past. The towering granite peaks surrounding my property stood as silent, enduring monuments to genuine strength. They represented the exact type of resilience my father had instilled in me since childhood. The toxic noise of arrogant socialites and desperate corporate climbers was entirely gone, replaced by the gentle rustle of falling leaves and the quiet hum of true, unassailable security. I turned away from the breathtaking mountain view and stepped back through the heavy sliding glass doors into the enveloping warmth of my living room. A large fire crackled cheerfully in the massive stone hearth, casting a soft, golden glow across the comfortable furnishings. There were no imported marble statues or ridiculous crystal chandeliers purchased strictly to intimidate guests. The space was designed entirely for authentic human connection. Sitting near the roaring fire was my father Victor. He looked completely at peace, wearing a simple faded flannel shirt and a comfortable pair of denim jeans. He held a glass of rich red wine, laughing deeply at a story being told by the man sitting across from him. That man was Nathan. The brilliant pediatric oncologist looked completely transformed from the person I knew a year ago. 6 months prior, he was a hollow, exhausted shell of a human being, slowly being drained of his life force by an entitled, narcissistic wife and a fiercely bigoted family. Tonight, the dark, heavy circles under his eyes were entirely gone. He radiated the vibrant, focused energy of a man who had successfully excised a malignant tumor from his very existence. Sitting on the plush rug near Nathan's feet was his young son, happily building a massive tower out of colorful wooden blocks. The little boy was completely insulated from the horrific financial and social collapse of his maternal bloodline. Nathan had successfully secured full physical and legal custody, ensuring his child would grow up valuing hard work and empathy over designer labels and fraudulent wealth. I walked over to the kitchen island and picked up my secure digital tablet. A live feed from a prominent Boston news station was playing quietly on the high-definition screen. I tapped the volume button slightly, raising the audio as the female anchor began reporting on the most anticipated urban redevelopment project of the decade. The screen shifted to spectacular aerial drone footage, hovering directly over the exact plot of land where Theodore's corporate headquarters had previously stood. The towering glass skyscraper that once housed their fraudulent real estate empire was entirely gone. In its place, the footage showed a massive fleet of heavy construction vehicles actively clearing the final remnants of concrete and twisted steel. The news broadcast seamlessly transitioned to a beautiful three-dimensional architectural rendering of the new facility, rising from the ashes. Bold, clean lettering across the screen announced the construction of a state-of-the-art pediatric healthcare center. The anchor explained that a private equity syndicate known as Apex Capital had seized the defaulted property and fully funded the massive philanthropic endeavor. They were building a world-class hospital wing dedicated entirely to providing advanced treatments for critically ill children, regardless of their family's ability to pay. I smiled, a deeply satisfied, genuine smile. I had completely erased the toxic legacy of a corrupt dynasty and replaced it with an institution that would generate infinite, authentic value for the community. I walked over to the seating area and handed the tablet to Nathan. He looked down at the glowing screen, watching the architectural rendering of the hospital wing he was going to lead. When the legal dust had settled, I had officially appointed Nathan as the chief medical director of the entire facility, granting him absolute executive control over the research budgets and treatment programs. He looked up at me, his eyes shining with profound, unwavering gratitude. We did not need to exchange a single word. We were two survivors who had successfully navigated a treacherous battlefield, emerging on the other side with our integrity and our resources completed intact. As Nathan handed the tablet back to me, the news anchor briefly summarized the ongoing criminal proceedings of the former property owners. The federal prosecutors had showed absolutely zero mercy. Theodore's desperate attempt to secure a plea deal by throwing his own son under the bus had spectacularly failed. Both men were currently sitting in heavily guarded federal holding facilities, awaiting trials that guaranteed mandatory minimum sentences of 20 years. They were stripped of their bespoke suits, forced to wear identical coarse orange jumpsuits, and eat highly processed cafeteria food. Their sudden, catastrophic removal from society had left Constance and Olivia entirely destitute. Without access to Jonathan's stolen capital or Theodore's fraudulent credit lines, the two arrogant women were violently shoved into the unforgiving reality of the working class. The gossip columns reported that Constance was currently working the cash register at a generic suburban grocery store, wearing a terribly unflattering polyester uniform. Olivia, having lost her husband, her child, and her mansion, was allegedly renting a tiny, damp basement apartment and working brutal double shifts as a waitress in a loud, crowded diner. The elite social circles they had once desperately worshipped had completely forgotten their names. They were permanently exiled ghosts, haunting the lowest rungs of the economic ladder they had spent their entire lives mocking. I set the tablet face down on the wooden coffee table, completely closing the book on their miserable existence. I took a slow, deep breath, feeling the absolute immense weight of my victory settle comfortably into my bones. The journey from a supposedly submissive wife to a ruthless corporate executioner had taught me a profound, undeniable truth about the nature of power and human relationships. For 5 agonizing years, I shrank my brilliant mind and suppressed my powerful presence just to appease a husband and his relatives whose entire identities were built on fragile arrogance and toxic classism. Many of us make this exact same catastrophic mistake in our own lives. We dim our own vibrant light so we do not blind the deeply insecure people surrounding us. We endure disrespect, emotional manipulation, and even outright abuse because we falsely believe that marriage or biological ties create an unbreakable bond that requires our endless personal sacrifice. This terrifying journey shatters that dangerous illusion entirely. True empowerment begins the exact moment you stop accepting the false narratives that manipulators project onto you. My ultimate triumph did not actually come from my massive trust fund or my ability to financially destroy my abusers. My true victory was the realization that my personal dignity is absolutely non-negotiable. Legal documents and shared last names do not give anyone a free pass to treat you like a disposable asset. A true family is not a heavy, inescapable cage where you are constantly judged and demeaned for your background. Instead, a genuine family is a safe sanctuary composed of people who respect your firm boundaries, protect your inner peace, and celebrate your authentic self without any toxic conditions. You never have to accept the table you were given if the people sitting there demand you eat the miserable scraps of their disrespect. You have the absolute power to stand up, walk away, and build your own magnificent table. Financial independence and unyielding self-respect are the ultimate armor against arrogant narcissists. When you strip away the masks you wear to appease others, You finally discover the unshakable granite foundation of your own self-worth. I had systematically burned down the fake, arrogant empire that tried to bury me. I had confidently seized the reins of my legacy and taken back my absolute, uncompromising freedom with my own two hands. When the dust finally settled on the spectacular collapse of Jonathan and his family, it was easy to get swept up in the sheer thrill of the corporate execution. We watched an arrogant dynasty crumble under the weight of its own greed, and we cheered for a woman who reclaimed her power from the people who tried to break her. But as I sat back and thought about the heavy construction machinery clearing away the ruins of that foreclosed mansion, a much deeper and more haunting realization washed over me. The story we just witnessed was never truly about toxic corporate debt or even a fraudulent marriage. At its very core, this was a narrative about the terrifying consequences of how we raise our children. It was a stark, unyielding mirror held up to the deepest responsibilities we carry as parents, trying to guide the next generation through a complex world. Consider the tragic arc of Jonathan and his father, Theodore. Theodore spent 4 decades building an empire driven entirely by ego-classism and a desperate need to feel superior to everyone around him. He measured the worth of a human being by the brand of their suit and the balance of their bank account. And because he was the patriarch of a traditional family structure, he passed that exact same toxic metric down to his son. Theodore did not raise a strong, independent man. He raised a fragile, terrified narcissist. By shielding Jonathan from the consequences of his actions and teaching him that wealth could simply erase incompetence, Theodore fundamentally crippled his own child. He denied Jonathan the most essential tools of human survival, which are honesty, fairness, and emotional awareness. When you raise a child to believe they are a god, you are actually preparing them for a spectacular, devastating fall. The absolute failure of Theodore as a father was cemented in that boardroom when he immediately betrayed Jonathan to the federal agents to save his own skin. He sacrificed the son he had corrupted, proving that a legacy built on arrogance has absolutely no loyalty, even to its own blood. Now look at the profound contrast presented by Victor and his daughter Emma. Victor was a man who controlled billions of dollars, yet he showed up to his daughter's rescue wearing a faded flannel shirt and scuffed boots. He did not raise Emma to rely on a massive trust fund or a flashy last name. He raised her with the rugged, self-reliant spirit that defines the very best of American culture. He took her to a cabin in the White Mountains and taught her how to chop firewood right alongside teaching her how to read a complex corporate balance sheet. He instilled in her a deep, unshakable sense of fairness and emotional resilience. Victor understood that true family responsibility does not mean handing your children a life of absolute ease. It means equipping them with the mental and emotional armor required to navigate a world that will inevitably try to tear them down. He gave her a granite foundation so strong that when she faced the ultimate betrayal, she did not shatter. She stood up, wiped the blood from her face, and took back her freedom. This stark dichotomy forces us to ask ourselves what we are actually passing down to the children sitting at our own dinner tables. In modern American society, there is an overwhelming pressure to provide our kids with endless comfort and material success. The American dream has slowly warped from a pursuit of honest hard work into a frantic race to ensure our children never have to struggle for a single second. We want to pave the roads for them, remove every obstacle, and shield them from every harsh reality. We measure our success as parents by the size of the inheritance we leave behind, rather than the depth of the character we cultivate. But we have to look closely at Nathan, the pediatric oncologist, who recognized the deep rot infecting his wife's family. Nathan understood that if he stayed in that luxurious mansion, his young son would eventually be poisoned by the same entitlement and cruelty that destroyed Jonathan and Olivia. Nathan made the agonizing but heroic choice to walk away from extreme wealth to protect the moral compass of his child. He chose the difficult path of honesty and emotional awareness over the easy path of fraudulent comfort. That is the ultimate act of parental love. He knew that guiding a child requires a willingness to walk through the fire yourself so they can learn how to survive the heat. Raising children within a traditional family structure requires us to be brutally honest with ourselves about our own flaws before we accidentally pass them on. Children do not listen to the lectures we give them, they meticulously mimic exactly what we do. If we show them that success is measured by crushing others, they will grow up to become monsters. If we show them that accountability is something to be dodged, they will become cowards who flee at the first sign of trouble. But if we model true resilience, if we teach them that genuine strength lies in treating people with dignity, regardless of their social standing, we give them an internal compass that will never fail them. As you reflect on the choices made by the characters in this journey, I encourage you to subscribe and follow Samantha Told Stories for more narratives that challenge our perspectives and explore the complex depths of human relationships. We share stories that strip away the superficial layers of life to reveal the hard, undeniable truths hiding beneath the surface. Joining our community ensures you will always have a front row seat to stories that make you think deeply about the life you are building. And the hardest truth of all is this: we spend our entire lives absolutely terrified of failing our children by not giving them enough. We exhaust ourselves trying to build massive, impenetrable fortresses of financial security and social status to keep them safe from the harsh, unforgiving realities of the world. We believe that shielding them from pain is the ultimate expression of our devotion. But perhaps the greatest betrayal a parent can commit is giving a child a life entirely free of struggle. Conventional wisdom dictates that a loving parent removes the stones from their child's path. Yet when you remove every consequence and cushion every single fall, you do not create a safe haven. You create a gilded cage that leaves them entirely defenseless when the real world inevitably breaks down the door. True love is not found in protecting our children from the fire. It is found in stepping back and letting them burn their fingers just enough to respect the flame. Take a long, hard look at the legacy you are building right now in your own home. Are you handing your children a heavy shield to protect their character? Or are you simply forging the chains that will ultimately destroy them?